Morning, Stanley.
Good morning, Bobby.
How you doing?
Okay.
Morning, Sam.
Good morning.
Vanna, this is James Perino. I'm on.
Good morning, Chief.
Good morning,
Good morning,
everybody.
James. Good morning, James.
Good morning.
Good morning, Jennifer.
Good morning,
How are you
Jennifer.
today? I just want to confirm right now, I see that Bobby is with us and Stanley, so we're waiting for several additional board members. Okay.
Good morning, Jennifer. James is also on the line. He's on the phone.
Okay, good deal. Thank you. Good morning, Felipe. Good morning, James. And
Good morning,
Bobby.
Felipe. Good morning, Meg.
Ben, I just want to confirm that we are live.
Yeah, we're live. Turn the room. We should be streaming.
So hopefully we will soon have quorum. We're waiting 3 other persons. Is that correct? 3 other board members?
Yeah, Jackie's making her way right now. And yeah, I believe we're waiting on Marco and Steve as well.
No. Tu hermano está todo pero esta mañana porque tenía una reunión a las 9 y tienes que estar aquí un sitio. No. No me invitaste porque una reunión a las 9.
Good morning.
¿Qué? ¿Sí o no? Dijiste que a las 9 tenía una reunión porque se mi calendario y me estuviste gritando y me dijiste egoísta.
For those who've joined us outside of the board, we're going to get started in just a minute. We're just waiting to ensure that we have those board members who said they will join with us. Alrighty. Please help me. Has anyone else joined? Are we at quorum?
I don't think anyone else has joined, but you're okay to start.
Okay. Good deal. Give me 1 second. I'm going to pull up the list of participants. All right. Good morning. Good morning to everyone. The special public hearing of New York City Board of Correction is now in session. Today and tomorrow, the board is conducting hearings to receive public comment on the proposed restrictive housing rule in accordance with the City Administrative Procedure Act. Though required, the board also views these hearings as critically important to the rulemaking process. As we saw in 2019, the public's input led to critical changes that have brought us here today. There are several key provisions in this proposed rule. It ends solitary confinement and all other current forms of restrictive housing on November 1st, 2021. Let me say that again. It ends solitary confinement and all other current forms of restrictive housing on November 1st, 2021, and replaces them with the Risk Management Accountability System, RMAS. RMAS is a 3-level progression model with a minimum 10 hours out of cell with the ability to socialize with at least one other person. Individualized behavioral support plans, steady, experienced case managers, periodic reviews by a multidisciplinary team, 5 hours of daily programming, and daily rounding by health and mental health staff. This proposed rule ends the use of restraint desks, routine restraint desks, for all by November 1st. It requires the department to use cells for de-escalation confinement after incidents rather than intake areas. It limits the scope of lockdowns to only housing areas that must be locked down. And it requires regular and public reporting by the department. This proposed rule aims to change the way the department responds to violence. It prioritizes safety and support for all and an environment where behavioral change is both possible and rewarded. Through the public comment period thus far, the board has received several requests for photos, drawings, and tours of the RMAS units. The board agrees that it is critically important for the public to have insight into the layout of these units. The department has determined that it would be inappropriate to release photos of the units for security reasons. Conducting tours of the units would also present challenges for staff and people in custody given the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The department has committed to providing renderings of the RMAS units, which we hope to receive prior to tomorrow's hearing. The board is also reviewing the requests that we have received, including a FOIL request for the photos, and will respond promptly. The Board of Correction has worked with the department to ensure that people in custody have the opportunity to review the rule and comment. The department has distributed a copy of the proposed rule packet to each housing area in the jail system. There is also a copy of the proposed rule in each law library for anyone who requests the rule. DOC and CHS included information on how to access and review the rule in the weekly COVID newsletter. DOC also issued a teletype to encourage staff to review and comment. The board has set up a dedicated voicemail box where anyone, including staff and people who are detained, can call to leave comment on the rule. The phone number for the voicemail box is the following: 212-669-7900. 212-669-7900. 1-800-848-7900. I'll say it one more time. The phone number for the voicemail box where anyone can call to leave comment on the rule. The phone number is 212-669-7900. When you call the number, you will be given options. Press option 2. Option 2. We strongly encourage all to provide their feedback on this rule prior to the public comment period closing date of April 16th, 2021. The closing date is this coming Friday, April 16th, 2021. We will now begin the public comment on the proposed restrictive housing rule. I've been given a list of speakers who signed up. I'm going to call each person's name. When you hear your name, please raise your hand using the hand icon below the participants list on your WebEx screen. If you don't see the participants list, click on the silhouette of a person on the menu at the bottom of your screen. Once you open that link, you'll get to the participants list. You should see the hand icon in order to raise your hand. When you raise your hand, we will unmute you and you will be able to turn on your video if you so choose. You can then begin your public comment. You will have 4 minutes. 4 minutes to speak today. I will tell you when it has been 4 minutes, and we will then have to move on to the next speaker. In order to ensure that every person is heard and given equal time, we will mute anyone who goes beyond 4 minutes. You will be told your time is up, and you will be muted to allow for the next persons to testify. To be fair to everybody, we have to equal the comment time. It will be 4 minutes, and that will be adhered to strictly. The board also welcomes written comment. You can email written comments to boc@boc.nyc.gov. Written comments can be emailed to boc@boc.nyc.gov. Or you may mail your comments to 1 Center Street, room 2213, New York, New York, 10007. 1 Center Street, room 2213, New York, New York, 10007. Public comment on the proposed rule closes this coming Friday, April 16th, 2021. Please be sure to submit your written comments before the end of the day, close of business, 5 p.m. on April 16th. I will now call on our first speaker, Keith Powers.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone, for giving me the opportunity to testify here today. I am City Councilmember Keith Powers. I'm the Chair of the Criminal Justice Committee for the New York City Council. I want to first thank Chair Jennifer Jones-Austin and the Board of Correction and the Mayor's Task Force for having me here today and all the work you've been doing. And I also want to thank everyone that's watching today and all those that helped bring us to today's hearing by speaking out on this issue and providing feedback throughout the rulemaking process. This has certainly been an ongoing journey in our city to achieve ultimate justice for those who have experienced the grave consequences of solitary, while also finding the appropriate balance of how to make sure that we are reducing violence in our jails and trying to be a leader in this country when it comes to our practices. Some of you know, in 2019, following the death of Layleen Polanco, myself and City Councilmember Speaker Johnson called for an end to solitary confinement in our city jails, which led to some hearings in 2019 to begin the conversation around how to revamp and change and ultimately end solitary confinement in our city jails. In that time period, myself, others, including the public advocate and Speaker Johnson, have advocated for the need to bring in a new model that respects the rights and humanity of people in custody, while also looking at leveling up programming and services that help reduce the violence inside of our city jails. Just a few months ago, I chaired a hearing in the City Council on this topic, and we heard from families with direct experiences of the injustices caused by the system, including the family of Laylene Polanco, and we heard lots of feedback and ideas on legislation that was before the City Council that dealt with this specific topic. So thank you for giving us, the public, an opportunity to weigh in on this today and tomorrow. I'll start by saying, I'm going to have a number of recommendations to this proposal that I think are really important and essential to make sure that we get this right. But I don't want to undercut the work here. I think it's important work, and I recognize that we are making significant progress here in this rulemaking, and this is a long overdue improvement to the current solitary confinement practices. And I want to thank the task force. I know Stanley Richards and others who had served on that for their work to try to get this right and try to get this balance while really making sure we make a declaration of our intentions to end solitary confinement. If we do this right, we will be leading the way for other major cities and be a leader throughout the globe when it comes to ending solitary confinement and also assisting and helping individuals who are in our custody. This public process to me is extremely valuable as we work together to end solitary confinement, to hear the voice of people that have been impacted by it and hear from folks who have been working in this area for years. I just want to, again, reaffirming that I think this is a major step forward. I want to just highlight a number of areas that the board should further address to strengthen this rule. And I think these are really critical, and you're going to hear this from the public here today as well. The first one is that while the proposed rule includes some, number of due process protections, I think it's still important that we include legal representation for individuals in disciplinary hearings. Access to legal counsel is critical to protect the rights of people in custody. And to me, this is an extension of an individual's basic right to have counsel and should be included as part of this process. It's something the council has included and talked about, and we've asked at the very outset of this process to be included. And I'd like to see us to have some way forward to make sure that folks can include counsel in their hearings if they choose to. Second, as the rule stands right now, and you're going to hear this from many people, there's no hard limit spent on this tier in this tiered system. And while the rule, of course, includes periodic reviews of individuals' placement, it doesn't create a hard cap on time spent in the 3 levels, particularly level 2 and level 3. And I believe, and I think others will say it too, believes too much discretion to keep individuals in these levels indefinitely. These definitive time limits can be essential to ensuring that these changes are substantive and long-lasting. And I'm going to join many others who I think are going to call for a real cap on time spent in these levels here today and tomorrow.
Council member, I hate to do this, but I have to be fair to everybody.
I'm going to finish right here. I'm just going to say, I'll just end with this. It is essential that also as part of this process, we do address the violence and we make sure that we are addressing violence. I know that was a major intention of the rulemaking. I think it's important as we do the rulemaking, we don't just do the rules, we make a major cultural shift at the department level to up programming, up resources, because we don't get anything right here if we don't actually invest in the other parts of the equation. So I'll leave it to that. And
I appreciate it, and we will follow up. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Council Member Helen Rosenthal. Councilmember Helen Rosenthal.
There we go. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. It's Councilmember Powers is a hard act to follow, and I really do wish I could give him a couple of minutes of my time, but I can't. So I'm going to launch a much shorter speech, but I wish I could just simply echo his words. I appreciate his words of gratitude to you, Chair Austin, members of the board, and the task force. So I'm Councilmember Helen Rosenthal, former chair of the Committee on Women and Gender Equity, and I'm testifying today because I too tried to think hard about what to do after the death of Laylene Polanco and came up with a bill that required a task force to 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 determine the better housing conditions for transgender individuals. And the important thing was we included many, if not the majority of the task force members were either advocates or people from the transgender community. I think what that advisory board will come up with is something that is representative and fair to those who have to, who are in jail confinement themselves. And it's why I'm not going to go through much of my testimony, but instead urge you, plead for you to listen to those with experience who have walked a day or who have lived a life in our jail system, who have studied this for a long time, because they're the ones who understand the complexity of the situation. I'm going to echo my colleague in saying that there has to be legal representation. There has to be a limit of how many days in RMAF level 115 should be the limit, if not fewer number of days. There have to be exceptions for people 25 years old or younger, 55 or older, people with mental health needs, physical disabilities or medical conditions or comorbidities. They just shouldn't be in any form of restrictive housing. Of course, people should not be chained and shackled during out of cell time. And there have to be overall limits just to make sure that in no way, shape, or form do we end up with indefinite solitary confinement. That's what we're really concerned about. So I'm going to end it up there. I look forward to seeing the changes in your amended rules, but most importantly, I urge you to listen and absorb and really take the recommendations of those who have been studying this issue for so long. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Councilmember Rosenthal and Councilmember Powers. Very much appreciated. We will now hear from five. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your last name, but five. Mualim Ike. I'm so sorry. And please correct me.
I don't believe Five's in the room right now.
I'm sorry, Bennett?
Five's not in the room right now.
Okay. We will come back to five if he comes. Danielle Gerard. Is Danielle Gerard with us? Doesn't appear to be.
Yes, I just made her a panelist, so she
Okay,
should.
good deal. Good morning, Danielle.
Good morning, Chair Jones Austin, board members, and Ms. Egan. I'm Danielle Gerard. I'm a senior staff attorney at Children's Rights. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I refer you to our written testimony for greater detail. As a member of the JAC, we support the testimony of all the advocates who comment on other aspects of the proposed rules while we focus on young adults. It is time for radical change at the department. Both the mayor and the board have promised to end solitary confinement, but the proposed rules fall woefully short. Throughout this process, we urge the board to keep in mind that 72% of incarcerated persons on Rikers are pretrial detainees and 52% have mental health issues. These factors make abolishing solitary in all its forms and developing and administering meaningful programming and services critical for just and humane treatment. One, RMAS housing is simply solitary confinement by another name. In a feat of Orwellian doublespeak, the rules frankly admit this. The department should never house young adults in RMAs. Based on restrictive housing units at the NIC and Secure, these units include cages that do not meet the core principles enunciated in the rules and do not provide open space essential for healthy, meaningful human interaction and engagement. Individuals move from their cell to a cage in front of it where they remain alone. At most, they can have some limited interaction with the person in the cage next to them. Even worse, there is no limit as to the amount of time that someone can be held in these conditions. As Children's Rights has testified repeatedly, excessive isolation is incompatible with current research and policy for older youth. We also note that young adults in ESH will continue to be shackled to desks for the next 7 months, but this shackling is barbaric and should be abolished immediately. The department has furnished no evidence that solitary confinement improves safety. There is no evidence that expanded restrictions on people's out of cell time and restraint desks improve safety. In fact, the Nunez Monitor's reports show that violence has increased all while the department houses young adults in various forms of solitary confinement, reduces out of cell time below 14 hours, and shackles young adults to desks in ESH when they are out of their desks, when they are out of their cells. 2, there is no evidence that commingling young adults with older adults reduces violence. Research shows that more age-appropriate programming, more services, and continued better training for officers does reduce violence. All young adults should be housed separate and apart from older adults. 3, as part of what should be the universal 14 hours out of cell time per day, young adults should have access to at least 7 hours of congregate out of cell programming and activities. The board should reinstitute the Adolescent and Young Adult Advisory Committee to provide regular input of advocates and providers concentrated specifically on programming and services for young adults and transparency in the actual provision of programming and services for this vulnerable population. 4, the proposed rules permit the department to request variances. We urge the board to rein in this Trojan horse and prevent further governing by variance. 5, the HALT Act recently passed is a floor, not a ceiling, for solitary confinement in city jails. We remind the board that the United Nations has specifically called for the full prohibition of solitary confinement for people in pretrial detention. We urge you to revise the proposed rules to abolish all forms of solitary confinement, no matter the euphemism, as promised by the mayor and the board. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let us now go to Anissa Sabor. Minute. Is Anissa Sabor with us?
I don't believe Anissa is in the room right now.
Okay.
I believe Anissa might have been having trouble signing in, so we might have to jump back to them.
Okay, we'll circle back to the people if we haven't heard from them. Melania Brown is the next person to testify. Melania Brown. Melania Brown.
I've made Melania a panelist, so they should be able to unmute themselves.
Hello,
All right.
everyone. Sorry.
Good morning.
Good morning. Can you please turn on my camera, if you can?
You should be able to turn on your camera using a button at the bottom of your screen.
Hello, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Melania Brown. As many of you may know, my sister, Laylene Polanco, died on June 7th, 2019, alone in solitary confinement. Since then, I became an activist and I turned my pain into a plan with a purpose. And my purpose is to ensure that no other family member goes through what my family went through, or no other human suffers the way my sister suffered. If my sister was alone in this alternative cell, the slightly larger size of the cell would have not saved her life. My sister still would have not been here with me today. RMAS is just another name for solitary confinement, a little tweak for solitary confinement. Nothing has changed. at all. RMS was not going to save my sister. My sister would have still been dead. When I come here and I pour my heart out to you guys, I pour my heart out because I want you guys to feel my pain. I want you guys to understand that I go through it daily, on the daily. I am in therapy. I carry my sister around me, around my neck in ashes. My sister is gone. You guys have to understand that these CEOs that watched my sister die, they took my church from me. They took my best friend from me. All right. RMAS, they're going to find another crack to continue to torture. Halt Solitary is in place. We must follow Halt Solitary. It's passed. It's the law. Why are we not following the law? We often talk so much about the protection of these CEOs, but they failed to protect my sister. They failed to help her. They laughed at her while she was taking her final breath. I watched that video over and over and over and over again. Matter of fact, it was released again by the Daily News if you guys would like to watch it this morning. It's not okay. These are humans we're talking about. These are humans. Getting another person in a cell so they can have interaction. How about if that person doesn't want to talk? How about if they don't get along? I have someone that I am close to, that I have a connection with, that was going through the same similar things because they use COVID as an excuse to lock these individuals up for hours a day. And he's in this other cell with this one other person, and they were like this. They had to remove them from one another because it was going to get bad. All right. Everybody is different. Housing somebody with one other person is not, it's not realistic for socializing. It's not realistic for human interaction with one other person. See, the problem is when these humans start getting treated like humans, they will act like humans. While they continue to get treated like animals, they're going to act like animals. And you guys want to fix the real problem? Go into your jail. Your CEOs are telling other new incoming CEOs, they're training them the wrong way. They're training them to be inhumane. That's where your problem is. Go to your CEOs. You need to hire people. You guys have activists behind those walls that don't even advocate for their humans behind those walls. You want to hire humans that really want to help them. I'll do it for free. Hire me. Put me behind those walls. And I'll show you what real change is. Okay? What's going on here is just solitary confinement by a different name. A larger size in the room was not going to save my sister. She would have still not been here with me today. And I appreciate you guys opening this platform. I appreciate you guys listening to our voices and taking in what we are saying. So I'll leave you with this. I am a sister with a broken heart. My heart would never be whole again. My sister was taken from me. And I am haunted by the video of those correctional officers, knowing they could have saved her life. They stood there and they laughed at her. And if I had a few words for them, it would be that they took part of me. They took half my rib. They took half my heart. They took the better half of me. So please end this. Please follow Halt Solitary. Please. It's in place. It's in place, and it has everything that these humans need. And if you need help behind those walls, I'm here. Give me a call. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Susanna Ekblad. Susanna Ekblad. Please, okay. Good morning. Please begin.
Good morning. And thank you, Ms. Brown. That was so powerful. So my name is Susanna Ekblad, and I'm a supervising social worker in the criminal defense practice at Brooklyn Defender Services. I've personally been meeting with people in custody on Rikers Island in this capacity for over a decade, and have worked with many people who are currently in restrictive housing. My comments today are going to focus on the narrow list of exclusions and the alarming position this board is proposing. The proposed rule fails to extend protections to a vast number of vulnerable populations, including young and older adults, people with disabilities, and people with serious medical conditions. While the proposed rule purports to end punitive segregation, it's a false narrative to say that the RMAS units will be any less harmful. They encompass the worst practices of extreme isolation couched under the guise of reform. This board is ultimately solidifying solitary confinement by another name with limited protections and zero time limits, ultimately allowing people to languish indefinitely. The board's own proposed rule acknowledges this reality within the narrow list of exclusions, yet, as written, the proposed rules exclude fewer vulnerable populations than what is already the practice. This is extremely dangerous and will put lives at risk. DOC has a history of ignoring protections and making dangerous choices that impact an individual's health and wellness, including death. BDS represented a man confined to a wheelchair who required daily medical attention put into solitary until his family stopped hearing from him that we learned of his placement. We immediately contacted the board, and within the day, this board advocated for his successful removal. Though we're grateful for the board's intervention, this situation should never have happened. And in the proposed rules, there's nothing to prevent this situation from repeating itself. And in fact, it allows it. People with disabilities in RMAS units will be confined to a cell for the majority of the day, separated from staff by another cage and a combination of hard metal fencing and plexiglass. It is barbaric and people will not be safe. Additionally, people with seizure disorders are repeatedly sent to solitary units. Our office has advocated on numerous occasions for the immediate transfer of people with known conditions, and the response from DOC is always security that overrides CHS. The workaround is to position a DOC officer who is not medically trained to sit in front of that individual's cell door so they can notify staff if anything happens. It's regularly reported that this assigned officer is either missing or asleep. People have injured themselves and even died due to the careless and dangerous decisions made by this department, and the board's proposed rule will do nothing to prevent this situation from repeating itself, and once again would allow for it to happen. Rather than representing bold progress that is warranted after the deaths of too many New Yorkers, including Khalif Browder and Layleen Polanco, these proposed rules only codify the known horrors of solitary confinement, rubber stamping the department's failings. In 2015, this board voted to exclude young adults from ESH, but now the proposed rules that you released would subject young people whose brains are still developing to torturous conditions of restrictive housing without strict time limits that would prevent the indefinite placement in such units. This is a shameful step backward. No one should be subjected to the dangerous conditions of restrictive housing, but at the very least, the board should exclude those individuals most at risk from all levels of restrictive housing. For our young and older people, people with disabilities and medical conditions. It is ironic that the reasoning behind restrictive housing is always safety, yet the research and data unanimously show that when we isolate people and treat them less than deserving, we actually make our jails and our communities unsafe. We urge the board to extend the exclusions. To truly meet the security goal, we must invest in strategies that uplift people and decrease violence rather than signing on to torture people indefinitely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let us now move to hear from Clayton Jamont. Clayton Jamont. I see that he is still a participant.
Yeah, if you could raise your hand, or I can unmute. I'll unmute you briefly, Clayton, if you can speak.
Okay.
You're unmuted now.
Clayton Jamont?
No longer in the room.
Okay. Kenwyn Richards is the next speaker.
That person's not in the room right now.
Okay. Jorge Marin, or Marin, forgive me again. Jorge Marin.
Or if you could raise your hand using the button on WebEx. Are you there? Jorge Marin just unmuted you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Please begin.
Okay, thank you. My name is Jorge Marin. I'm a New York City Correctional Officer since November 3rd, 2005. I worked at Rikers Island for 6 or 7 years. Then I got transferred to MDC to prison. I would like to say that I read the proposal that you guys want to impose, and you need a lot of changes, okay? Because like the other people before me spoke, nothing's gonna change. Mind you, I'm speaking on behalf of correctional officers and inmates and civilians that work in the jails. What I have seen, the disaster that happened, that is continuing happening, but the death are out of control. I don't know if you guys remember me, but some of you guys have been on the board for the past 7 years. In 2014, 2012, 14, and even to 16, I came to your guys to ask for help because since 2012, my jail was getting out of control, right? Due to a lot of things, managers, you know what I'm saying, and lack of equipment and programs. And I came there with a list 3 times. What do I need? What the stuff that we need to improve the safety to everything for inmates and correction officers. And your guys didn't never do anything about it. I remember Chief Jones came to speak to me on behalf of the then Commissioner Ponte, and I took that man to my post, which is a high classification post, and I showed him all of the deficiencies of my post that make it hard for me to work.
Mr. Marine, your volume has gone down. Mr. Marine, your volume has gone down.
To fix the problems. It was about 12 problems, major problems that we have in my post. None of them to this day was fixed. And I continue working in the post, and I continue trying my best with the officers to do a job and to protect and the inmates. Nothing was done. Nothing. Then I went again. I wrote about 14 things to improve the safety and the condition for staff and inmates and civilians. You guys receive it. You guys called the correction department. A chief that retired called me in her office. We spoke about it. Out of the 14 or 12 things, you only fix 1. So when people talk about the correction officers, we know the problem. Some of us might be, maybe, but we know the problem is management. And I would like for the managers and my union representation members with all the other organizations to sit down, have a discussion on how we're going to improve these conditions for both inmates and correction officers. Because I can tell you, it's not correct. People want to blame the correction officers. If I don't have enough time to explain to you how many times I went over my duties because I had to do things for the inmates. Because when I asked the department, let me get this, let me get X, Y, and Z, they said, okay, we don't got the budget.
Mr. Marine, I've given you more time as I've given to other persons, but I am going to have to move on now. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you very much. The next 3 persons who are scheduled to speak are Anissa Sabor, Jules, or Jules, forgive me, Sam, and Gary Williams. We'll begin with Anissa Sabor.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for holding this hearing. My name is Anissa Sabor, and I am a solitary survivor. And I know that solitary is torture. right? And I appreciate the work that you and the board are doing to try to hear from people like myself who has experienced solitary in a way that has been detriment to my health. I've been diagnosed with PTSD and major depression. After spending 61 days in solitary confinement on Rikers Island, almost losing my life in solitary because someone set a fire to their cell. The individuals in solitary who did not set the fire was allowed to stay locked in their units, right, with this smoke-filled plastic smell all night. Just the fear of being locked in a place where you cannot get out in a fire. I don't know if anybody's ever been in a fire in your home, in your place of work, and not able to escape. And know that feeling of trauma and fear. I carry this with me throughout my life. And every time I hear someone either going to solitary and spending long periods of time, or someone dying, like Khalif Browder and Layleen Polanco, it just brings back that memory. And it's traumatic, but I try very hard to deal with it. It's not easy, but I do it. And I come to spaces like this to share my experience in hope that people who have the authority to make some change would make that change. And so after I reviewed the board's proposed recommendations for these new RMASH units, or whatever they're called, I realized that they're taking you from one cage to another. And I thought about that incident. Being removed from an isolated cell to be put into a cage where you're in the middle of a room somewhere, locked in a cage by yourself, and the rest of the facility is on fire. And you cannot get out. As they claim, there's supposed to be officers there to watch you. They're not letting you out. They're going to tend to the fire, as they did when I was in it. And so I know that from my own experience, that people should not be held in cages. These RMUs should not be individualized. Melania said it, you know, being locked in a cell or in a cage with one other person is like putting two dogs in a cage at a dog fight. So I am begging you to rethink the way that we treat human beings. I know that we need to have human interaction, and everyone should be entitled to be released and be able to engage in meaningful programming. Let me say this really quick, because I know I don't have a lot of time. If I would have had an attorney speak up for me or someone to advocate for me, I would have never gone to solitary. The individual that supposedly had a confrontation with me went home the next day. I was then brought down for a hearing, and when I tried to explain that to the hearing officer, they told me, oh, well, if you don't like it, appeal it. And I was actually sentenced to 120 days. And I know my time is running out, but I just want to say that we need to really think about the humanity and the lives of these people that we have in our custody. And I thank you for letting me speak this time. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you. Very much appreciated. The next person is Joel Sam, or Hule Sam. Forgive me. Please give me the correct pronunciation of your name, and I'll try to commit it to memory.
That person's not in the room right now.
Okay. Gary Williams.
Hello, could you hear me?
Good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Gary Williams. I'm a correction officer. I've been a correction officer for the past 11 years, and I'm not too sure if you guys are aware. There's a major issue as far as gangs within the city and behind the city jails. A lot of inmates don't feel safe due to the extremely high numbers of gangs that's being held in DOC custody, and quite a few, from my experience, rather be in punitive segregation or just to feel safe so they won't get cut. I'm not sure if you guys saw the slashings that's happening on a daily basis of these violent individuals are committing. And what about the officer safety and the other inmate safety who feel like, since there's a high amount of gangs in jail, what's the solution to that? From my experience, when they had punitive segregation in GMBC, which is closed now, I saw one inmate that was locked up. And, when I was working, I would speak to him and I would talk to him about life and tell him, things he need to do to stay out of jail. And he really appreciated it. So for some who's talking about punitive seg is inhumane, for some people just don't want to be bothered and they feel safe just being alone and don't have to worry about the violence that's happening in general population. Like I said, if there's no consequences for bad behavior, what's the solution? You can't. I mean, if an inmate cut someone today and then tomorrow he just moved to a different housing unit and cut him again, what about that innocent individual have to live with the consequences of a scar on their face for the rest of their life or being brutally harmed physically? It's I don't know. It have to be some type of punishment for bad behavior, because in the city, when you commit a crime in the city, you're going to Rikers Island. So what's the punishment when you commit a crime when you're within the city jails? It have to be unfortunately, solitary confinement is a necessary evil, and I wouldn't say evil, but a necessary tool to prevent violent individuals from harming other people. And that's it, basically. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. Let us now hear from, pulling up the list, I'm going to call the next three names, and so people are in position. John Lopez, Kev Alex, followed by Nicole Valentine. So the first person is John Lopez, whose hand is raised. Please begin.
Good morning. My name is John Lopez. I've worked for the
Good morning.
Department of Corrections. First of all, I want to say good morning to board members and council members. I worked for the Department of Corrections for 24 and a half years. I retired 3 years ago. And this proposal that you guys are putting in effect, I'm hoping that you will really rethink everything that needs to be addressed. My background in the Department of Corrections, I've experienced working at different various locations on Rikers Island, Manhattan Courts. I retired as a forensic investigator, so I was there in all the inmate deaths. And the reality is, yes, there is, when we put people in punitive segregation, that they do tend to decompensate and go through their breakdown. But the reality is that we have a percentage of inmates on Rikers Island that are very violent. I use a diagnosis, I call it the IED, where we have inmates who are intermittent explosive disorder. And it's a trigger where if you say the wrong thing, if you act the wrong way, or you say the wrong words, they will just punch you in the face. Okay, we have that population there. We have predatory inmates where they prey on the weak. And these are issues that we see on a day in and day out basis. Now, in 1995, I just want to give you a little history. In 1995, the violent rate was very high. And Bernard Currick was the commissioner at the time. And we went from having 123 slashings and stabbings, or rather 100% slashing and stabbings. It dropped down to like 5% when we instituted teams. I'm sure you're familiar with teams, total efficiency accountability management systems. Then we created what was called the RAP unit, Reducing Adolescent Problems, where I was a member of it and got together with 3 other officers, and we wrote a curriculum to reduce the violence in the community. And we had kids come into the jails to give some inmates an opportunity to express their struggles and their challenges. Okay, we also started the gang intelligence, and then we started this new law, which you guys are familiar with, the 8.5 to 25 years of slashings, stabbings, and assaults. And when that law passed, the inmates calmed down. And we went from having 100% slashing and stabbings down to about 5%. So the violence went down, and we still had punitive segregation. But the reality is that I like this whole program that you guys put in place. When I was about to retire, you put in place that program. I wrote it down here. Give me a second. The risk, RMAS. I think that's a great program to step up, step down. But the reality is, our problem is there's a systemic problem. There are different organizations that are working together. You guys come and watch us and pay attention. You send members that check out the jails, but there's a problem because you have DOHMH, okay, psychologists and psychiatrists that work with the Department of Corrections. Then you have other organizations, and everybody has to work together. The problem is that ideally, this program will work if it's done right. But the problem is, in reality, there's a lack of resources. We have the lack of psychologists that come in, you don't come in. I know because I work for Health Affairs Unit. I work directly with the Deputy Commissioner for 7 years. And I saw the insight, the problems, the systemic issues, the lack of resources with psychiatrists and psychologists coming in, the lack of officers, the disgruntled officers, the inmates that are dealing with violence. These are issues that you don't see. And as an officer working in a housing area, these are some of the issues that we have. I've gone into taking a post.
Mr. Lopez, your time has expired.
Can you give me 30 seconds more?
I've given you an additional 20 seconds. Please submit your testimony via writing. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Kev Alex? Okay. Nicole Valentine?
That person's also not in the room.
Okay, the next 3 people are Brandon Holmes, Darlene McDay, and Jack Beck, beginning with Brandon Holmes. Brandon Holmes, please raise your hand. Bennett, do you want to unmute this person?
Yeah, here we go.
Oh, okay. Good morning. Mr. Holmes, please begin. Are you with us? Bennett, is there a technical problem?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Please
Thank
begin.
you. My name is Brandon Holmes, and today I'm testifying on behalf of my cousins, aunts, and neighbors who have been brutalized by the city of New York for generations, and myself, who was displaced as a child, as law enforcement, the war on drugs, and gentrification separated my family for decades. For years, we have seen the DOC present new variances seeking to bend the rules in their favor, and every time the board has heard these variances, advocates have turned out in droves to reject them, presenting evidence-based testimony and exposing our lived experience as survivors of Rikers, survivors of solitary, and the loved ones of people who are no longer with us today. But their department's fear-mongering and disgusting lack of accountability or transparency has continued to win over the board. These officers who testify in the final hour with stories of slashing or gang violence, which to date, none of their current practices have succeeded in addressing, just do not tell the true story of how we can address violence on the island. Just a second ago, an officer literally called solitary a necessary evil. It may have been a slip of the tongue, but if that's what they're saying in these public forums with an oversight board and asking questions like, what else can we do? It's clear that they have no understanding or interest in restorative programming or actual violence mediation. Next month, we're going to see an 11th Nunez report, and we have to ask ourselves, what has the board done for the last 10 reports on violence? As advocates, we're clear what we are up against outside of the BOC. This mayor was dragged to taking the position of closing Rikers, but we have an opportunity to look at the board in a completely new light, an independent oversight board which can begin to help us define what safety and justice looks like, including programming in local jails. And one thing has to be clear, that we will not accept the status quo. This board and past boards have blood on their hands. Some of you may be new in your role and were not there at the time that people died in custody. Some of you may believe you are doing all that you can with the limited power you hold. And I do trust that at least a couple of the members are really driven to transform this city for the better. So we cannot let this process end here. We have given you tangible improvements to this plan. We have done that for years, and we have done that again after you've shown us what your rulemaking process will produce. And we want a tangible commitment to advocating for and adopting these additional demands. If you believe that this is not in your power, then please spend your time and energy speaking out with advocates. No more closed door meetings or holding cards close to your chest. It is condescending to meet with advocates and tell us that this is better than it was, or we need to show up and continue to speak when folks like Anissa, Victor, Melania through her late sister, Darlene McDay, who's living without her son today, come every single meeting to dump their hearts into testimony in this only public forum available to talk about the conditions of confinement. We will continue to mobilize and fight for our neighbors, but don't get it twisted. You have to make our bold vision possible by implementing it. So we ask the board to continue driving this process and don't let this be the end, and adopt the demands that we've presented to the BOC. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Darlene McDay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Please begin.
My name is Darlene McDay. You've heard me speak before regarding my son, Dante Taylor, who was not in the city jail, but in the upstate jail in Wendy Correctional Facility. And yesterday I sent some of you a report from the COC that shows that after an investigation from the OSI, my son was assaulted and brutalized. After that, I also sent you a dismissal from service for one of the sergeants. And I got this recently, and it made me confused because I know that he's still working. And that's because of the system and the way it's set up. These officers are allowed to be fired technically by the DOC and then appeal and then keep their job after the investigation showed what they did to my son. It is incredible that this is a system that we're working with. And that's why it's even more imperative that we make these rules so tight that they cannot get away with this. I also sent you a Suffolk County investigation. It was the jail that he was in when he first got arrested. He was 19 years old. He was immediately assaulted by several officers. And as you see the rundown on that Suffolk County investigation, you can see that those officers lied. It was realized, found out that they lied. They took the little bit of money my son was allowed to have in his account at the time to do a hearing, which was $50. They took that money, wouldn't let him buy any commissary, didn't give him a toothbrush, wouldn't let him shower, wouldn't give him any food for 4 days, and wouldn't let me see him. And on the 4th day, when I went to see him, he was shaking. He hadn't eaten anything. Somebody rolled him a rotten peach so that he was picking it off for 4 days, he told me. This is how he was treated. And I didn't know for 4 days because he had no phone call. So when I found out, talked to the lawyer, they sent a letter. A lieutenant or someone went up there and finally had him moved. And when they had him moved, they had to move to the next county over, a different jail. But 6.5 years later, 3 years after he died, come to find out there's a video. And I sent you the stipulation. That was the first indication that I had that there was actually a video of the incident. So they knew all along that my son did not do what they said he did, come off the wall, basically, that these officers lied. And you know what they got? 6.5 years after they did it, they got a slap on the wrist. They lost 60 days of their vacation time, 2 officers, when so many others lied about it. So I sent you a letter yesterday, testimony, and I just want you guys to realize that this is what happens sometimes behind the scenes. And regardless of people, if they're well-intentioned, things like this happen. And failure to bring people to mental health appointments, you saw that in the COC report. My son wasn't refusing mental health appointments. He'd be happy to get out of his cell. They wouldn't let him. They wouldn't let him call me. They wouldn't let me visit. They wouldn't let him have anybody there at all. And if you don't make sure that people have their support systems, people are at so much risk, so much risk. And you have to stop damaging people. A lot of people, they've been damaged as children. You know, we can't keep doing this to them. The legal representation is so, so important. My son was not allowed to have one person there to
Ms.
represent
McDade,
him.
I'm going to give you another 10 seconds, but we do have to move on.
Okay. And I'm sorry. And very important types of infractions that people go in for. My son, when he died, I think I've told you this, has been in for smoking. He didn't do anything violent whatsoever. I mean, you know, so they talk about all the violence.
I'm sorry that I do have to ask.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Jack Beck. Good morning. Good morning. You're unmuted. You can begin.
Hello. And can I get on the screen or not?
Yeah, I believe you have the ability to do that. Start video.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
I am Jack Beck. I'm part of the Hall campaign, but I have worked on solitary confinement for 40 years at the Prisoners' Rights Project. Starting in 1980, I litigated solitary confinement. After 23 years, I was at the Correctional Association of New York, and I've gone into nearly every solitary confinement unit in the state system. And now I'm part of the national organization, Unlock the Box, in which we are funding reform of solitary confinement in 18 different states. I mention this because I have real experience with the challenges of trying to reform solitary confinement. And my conclusion is that the only way to change solitary confinement is to have tremendous specificity and detail in the rules that you implement that will limit the authority of correctional systems to overcome your intent to make improvement. And unfortunately, I don't believe you have done that with your current rules. Although I believe there are problematic issues with several aspects of the proposed rules, I want to focus on 2 topics. One is the out-of-cell area, and second is provision of programs. The rules fail to define out-of-cell time, and the limited information provided to date by the board does not really give us a sense of what out-of-cell spaces will exist, how RMAS residents will access those spaces, and how those spaces will be used. Without that information, we really are left to speculate, and our speculation finds that they are clearly inadequate. We have been informed that in RMS level 1, there will be cages right outside of the cell, and that the only interaction people will have potentially with program staff, but also others, is to speak to the person in the adjacent cage. This clearly is inadequate in many different respects. What if the nearest resident does not want to come out of his or her cell or to converse with the neighbor, or only spends a short time out in the external cage area? Is this the only person the resident will have access to for interaction? How is this significantly different from what occurs in solitary now, when persons in adjacent cell frequently talk through vents or or through their cell doors? Is the fact that persons can potentially talk to someone in adjacent cage the significant reform we have been pressing for? Certainly not. Interaction with only one other person in a double cell is considered solitary confinement generally by correctional experts. And those of us who have helped draft and advocate for HALT would vehemently assert that the configuration of RMAS Level 1 constitutes solitary confinement under the HALT law. What really needs to be done is that the rules should provide out-of-cell programming space that is separate from the cell, where residents can go to engage in conversation, recreation, programming, and therapeutic activities. This type of congregate out-of-cell activity is required by HALT, but is not provided here. The advocates have urged 14 hours out-of-cell time, but the current proposal rules represent almost no meaningful out-of-cell activity for Level 1 residents, and that is where the most time that people in the RMS will spend. The rules related to programming are even more problematic for a lack of definition. They fail to specify any time requirements for out-of-cell programming or to mandate that any of this programming or productive activity, which is also potentially included in program, must be done in a congregate setting. And it leads to the inescapable conclusion that docs will have unlimited discretion to provide pro forma programming similar to the in-cell workbooks that are provided nationally to solitary confinement residents across the country. The design of the out-of-cell cages leads to the
Just want you to
inevitable...
note, as I've given other people another 15, 20 seconds, I'm giving that to you, so please.
Okay, thank you. That the program is going to be one-on-one interactions with program staff. That is going to be very limited in nature, and that they'll really be doing their programming potentially in their cell. There's no furniture necessarily provided. Clearly, the programming definitions are grossly inadequate to actually address the problems of solitary confinement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Beck. The next three speakers, Scott Paltrowitz, Sandra Sweet Novelties, and Alice Sturm Sutter. The next up is Scott Paltrowitz. Is Scott Paltrowitz with us? Yes. Okay, you are unmuted. You can begin.
Great, thank you so much. The harm of solitary confinement stems from the lack of meaningful human interaction and programming. That is what causes people to cut themselves and bang their heads against the wall. That is what causes people to start fires in their cells, to do anything they can to get out of this torture. That is what leads people to deteriorate and decompensate, and in turn makes the jails and outside communities less safe, not more. Yet after massive public outcry over the death of Layleen Polanco, following the deaths of Khalif Browder and Jason Echeverria and Bradley Ballard and so many other people, after the mayor of the city of New York and this board promised to fully end solitary confinement, after months of delay, after nearly a decade of the board purportedly studying methods for actually addressing violence, this is the solution proposed. Move a person from the cell where they sleep to a slightly larger connected cell, call it out of cell time, call it an alternative, but leave them there alone, 24 hours a day, indefinitely. This is not ending solitary confinement. This is creating a new form of solitary confinement by another name. And we don't have to guess what the outcomes will be. An October 2020 internal report of the board itself, obtained through a FOIA request, shows that over half of all fires in the city jails, and 60% of fire-related use of force incidents took place in the very same structurally restrictive housing units that form the basis of this proposed rule. At the time of the report, there were only 36 people in such units, out of a total New York City jails population at the time of roughly 4,500 people. In other words, less than 1% of all people in the city jails carried out more than 50% of all fires. The internal board memo reported that, quote, discussions with board and department staff as to why fires may happen so frequently in these units suggests people are trying to get moved out of these units and or feel they have no other way to bring attention to their concerns about conditions in the unit and or feel they have no way of controlling their own lives. These are the conditions the board is planning to replicate and expand with these rules. This is somehow ending solitary confinement. This is somehow improving safety. New York City is going to spend money constructing more of these cruel and abhorrent environments. I'm sorry, but this is not difficult. Ending solitary confinement must mean ending solitary confinement. Simply consider and treat people in the city jails as fellow human beings. Out of cell time doesn't mean being alone in another cage. Ending solitary confinement doesn't mean placing someone alone in another cage. Treating people as human beings and ending solitary confinement means the most basic practice of allowing people to interact with other human beings in the same physical space, in a space that is conducive to meaningful interactions. This rule does not even comply with the recently enacted Halt Solitary Confinement Act, which of course it must, let alone go further to end solitary as has been promised. The Halt bill prohibits segregated confinement beyond 15 consecutive days. But being alone in a cell in RMAS levels 1 and 2 are segregated confinement, whether or not this board or the department calls it out of cell time, and thus HALT prohibits anyone from being in that environment for more than 15 consecutive days. HALT also requires that all alternative units to solitary generally have at least 7 hours of congregate out-of-cell programs and activities comparable to the general population. That's the bare minimum. But again, this board and the mayor promised to do so much more than HALT. You all promised to fully end solitary confinement. That means every person in the city jails must have access to the basic minimum standards this board has set for the jails in general of at least 14 hours out of cell per day.
I'm giving
with again
you
at
another
least
15 seconds. Just
thank you.
take note.
7 of those 14 hours involving congregate programming activities. That is what evidence shows reduces violence and improves safety. This is a once-in-a-lifetime historic opportunity, and I urge each and every one of you to dig deep into your heart and mind, rise to the moment, and adopt a rule that actually, truly, and fully ends solitary confinement in all its forms. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just wanted to be noted that this proposed rule came out before the HALT legislation was passed, and that we are crosswalking it to make sure that we are aligned. Thank you. The next person who is scheduled to speak is Sandra, Sweet Novelties.
That person's not in the room.
All right. Alice Sturm-Sutter.
That person's also not in the room.
All right. The next 3 people, Simone Seberg, Olga Delgado, Roger Clark. The first is Simone Seberg.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, please begin.
Good morning. My name is Simone Seberg, and I'm the Jail Services Social Worker at Brooklyn Defender Services. I speak with people from across New York who are incarcerated in our city's jails on a daily basis, and it is their experiences that have informed my comments today. The board's proposed rule on restrictive housing fails to eliminate the torture this board and this mayor promised to end. For years, this board has heard directly impacted people and advocates discuss the harms of isolation, the lack of accountability, and the urgent need to bring comprehensive change to protect all people in New York City jails. This proposed rule legitimizes the worst aspects of extreme isolation while favoring the needs of the department over those confined to its custody. You will hear my BDS colleagues expand on various issues of the proposed rule, but I will be focusing on the narrow definition and scope of restrictive housing and restrictive status, which, as currently written, fails to account for many of the department's unofficial but pervasive practices and will thus continue to allow the department to make discretionary decisions around restrictive housing with no regulation or due process. Due to time, I refer you to BDS's written testimony that provides more detail and includes our proposed language on definitions, but I do want to highlight a few examples this board must consider. Number 1 is restrictive housing, specifically deadlock. Deadlock is a status imposed on an individual where the person can be housed in a general population unit, but they themselves are subjected to restrictive conditions. They have less than 14 hours out of cell, sometimes with a 24-hour lock-in, not afforded due process, but are not separated from general population. After a FOIL request, we learned there is no written policy despite it being a well-known and pervasive practice by the department. This abusive tactic is certainly a form of restrictive housing that falls outside the current proposed definition. It illustrates a serious failing of the current rule that this board must consider. Number 2 is restrictive status, specifically high classification. Other than reporting requirements, these rules do not specify the use or limit the use of restrictive statuses. Restrictive statuses or classifications have a significant harmful impact that undermines any rehabilitative purpose that the department allegedly seeks to serve. For instance, restrictive classifications allow DOC to deny broad groups of people access to important programs. The justification is that these people are classified as high security by DOC or are the subject of unsubstantiated gang allegations based on no standard of evidence and with no meaningful opportunity to appeal. In a recent case, a BDS criminal defense attorney successfully advocated that her client, who had a history of substance use, would serve reduced jail time if he participated in a program for people struggling with addiction. Despite agreement by the client's parole officer and the DA, the attorney learned from Correctional Health Services that the client was denied entry into the program because of his high security classification, a designation which stemmed from a decade-old incarceration where DOC identified him as gang affiliated. Although the client was not in a gang and was fully committed to participating in the program, he was not able to move forward with the agreement because of the classification. Not only do these classifications render rehabilitative efforts ineffective, but they actually obstruct the goal of creating a safe and secure environment. These classifications severely limit access to crucial services such as programming, mental health, law library, and counsel visits, either because these services are not provided or because there is an excessive wait time for the single escort assigned to the unit. Once someone is given a high classification, problems with access to care and programming are exacerbated. It is essential that the BOC address restrictive classifications in the rules around restrictive housing. Currently, the department does not provide any due process when designating people in one of these restrictive classifications or address any duration, conditions, or terms for being removed from these classifications. DOC has shown time and time again that, given the opportunity, they will find loopholes to maintain the most harmful practices. Thank you for your consideration on this crucial issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We will now move to Olga Delgado.
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me?
Good morning. Please begin.
Good morning, Board of Corrections. I am speaking on behalf of people in jails. The board must amend its rules to actually end solitary confinement. They should interact with several people at a time in the same open space that is conducive for healthy humans. People must be treated as human beings, have the opportunity to regular activities with other humans in spaces that are conducive to interact normally. There is no need to construct any new units, and certainly the city should not construct more punitive and isolated units. People should have out-of-cell time in large spaces. People should have access to their own counsel and legal advocate. Then restraints desks and other forms of restraint during out-of-cell time. My son, Ricardo Delgado, was in Rikers 2.5 years, and at that time, 1 year he was in the box with handcuffs attached to the desk. And when he came out was because I came to visit him 2 or 3 times a week so he could come out and see people. We saw each other with a thick glass, could not hear him when he spoke. On Mother's Day, could not hug or kiss him. He really needed me at that time, and that was really damaging him. He was only 19 years old. He was going crazy, talking to a little ant or roach that was in the cell. He was still developing his brain, but started a torture at a very young age. He was hearing voices when he came home. It was torture. They also used excessive force on one of my son's friends. They broke his fingers while he was in handcuffs. Instead, Board of Correction should start new programs to educate these young people with education or jobs. Many organizations need people to work for them like they do in the farm facility in Virginia. They cultivate their own vegetables and raise their animals so they can eat and go to church and be better persons when they come out to society. In cages, boxes, is not going to happen. So end solitary confinement in Rikers. They are human beings. It's inhuman. They need real programs, opportunity for human engagement, and pro-social programming, and solitary confinement in Rikers. Thank you. A mother in pain.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The next person is Roger Clark.
That person's
I'm sorry, Bennett, I did not hear you.
that person's not in the room.
Okay, good deal. The next three persons up are Lauren Teichner, Jordan Rosenthal, and Hannah Perry. The first person is Lauren Teichner. Is Lauren Teichner in the room?
Just made them a panelist.
Great. Can you hear me?
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Lauren Teichner, and I'm a team leader at the Defenders. I have the honor of testifying today on behalf of one of my longtime clients, an extremely resilient young man who I will call Mr. Jones, which is not his real name. While he was a teenager, Mr. Jones was held at NIC for 1 year and 5 months. At only 19 years old, he was locked in a cage for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no hearings, no review of his placement, and no meaningful connection to the outside world. DOC may have officially called these cages general population, but they amounted to solitary confinement and torture for Mr. Jones. Yet solitary confinement is banned for individuals under the age of 21. Mr. Jones's cage had 3 areas. The first contained his bed and his toilet. The second, which was right next to the first one, contained a TV and a phone, which he and one other person in custody had access to. The third was a so-called rec area that was open to the sky, but contained no exercise equipment and was too small to run around in. The only people that Mr. Jones had regular contact with were the officers and the one other person in the cell directly next to his. His Bronx Defenders team reached out to members of the board about this vicious backdoor solitary unit at NIC, and we requested photos of it and a better understanding of its purpose and its scope. We followed up with the executive director of the board about Mr. Jones giving his real name soon thereafter, but unfortunately that was just as the COVID pandemic was setting in and movement was paused. We followed up again later in 2020, wondering why Mr. Jones was still being held in this highly restrictive unit. Finally, we were told that because the unit was technically general population, there was no way to challenge his placement there. Mr. Jones never had a hearing before being placed in this backdoor solitary unit, and there was no leveling up. He was a high school student, and yet DOC denied him access to education while in this cage, despite our repeated requests. That education was his right. He told me, they have us sitting here for such and such amount of years and not going to school. We can't better ourselves. And I didn't know what to tell him. I didn't know how to help him. Mr. Jones completely missed the latter part of his high school education. What's more, the most awful aspects of living in NIC for Mr. Jones were the repeated harassing strip searches. Why were these necessary with no physical contact with anyone outside of his cage? We believe the purpose was to harass and humiliate, to break his spirit. Once, when Mr. Jones objected to a search, correctional officers beat him and slammed his head into the ground. He now suffers from hearing loss and must wear hearing aids, a teenager. On top of everything else, Mr. Jones contracted COVID while at NIC. And that means, given his complete isolation, he probably contracted it from DOC staff. Correctional Health Services alerted my office early in the pandemic that Mr. Jones was at high risk for severe illness from COVID due to having asthma. Yet proper precautions were obviously not taken for him. When he got it, he had serious difficulty breathing. He could barely speak on the phone, but all he wanted was to talk to his mother. She told me she was worried he would die there. He had to be placed in a secluded medical room at West Facility, his vital signs monitored closely until thankfully he recovered. And then he was moved right back to his cage at NIC. This was torture, plain and simple. It is astounding to me that the board wants to expand this awful torture unit. Isn't the Board of Correction tasked with protecting people in custody and enforcing their human rights? We must work to eliminate these hidden cages at Rikers, especially for young people like Mr. Jones. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Teichner. The next person is Jordan Rosenthal.
That person's not in the room.
Okay. Hannah Perry is the next speaker scheduled.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Please begin.
Hi, my name is Hannah Perry, and I'm a staff attorney in the Civil Rights and Law Reform Unit at the Brooklyn Defender Services. Restrictive housing at the city's jails is traumatizing, and while the board may remove the word punitive from the name of this restrictive housing scheme, it remains a system of punishment in the jails. As such, and as long as the department continues to punish people in its custody with an even greater deprivation of liberty than they already endure, and one that can cause serious and even permanent effects to their well-being, there must be real due process protections in place. Yet, as it stands currently, and as it would remain under the proposed rules, the process for adjudicating alleged infractions is one-sided, rife with coercion, and leaves people in DOC custody without any fair chance at navigating the hearing process. The way to ensure a fair process within the city's jails is access to representation throughout this adjudicative process. Even with the proposed rules, the system for adjudicating infractions has minimal procedural safeguards in place. Picture a person in the city's jails charged with an infraction. This person already has limited liberties, which are on the line when an infraction is alleged. And once this type of allegation is made, this person is thrown into a complex system, difficult to understand even to those familiar with it, with little to no tools to help them navigate it. They have no advocate to advise them about whether to sign a notice of a hearing, attend a hearing, make a statement at a hearing, or provide evidence. Only in very limited circumstances, such as where someone is illiterate, hard of hearing, or blind, or not proficient in English, is someone entitled under the rules to a hearing facilitator. But even then, the rules don't explain what this facilitator's responsibility is. But it is clear that while they may explain some rules, they do not advocate for the person, advise them, or help them make any of the important decisions throughout this process. The weight of the department bears down on this person who lacks the resources to help them understand it. The accusations and infraction tickets are written by DOC employees. The investigation is conducted by members of the DOC. Evidence at the hearings is provided by the DOC, and the evidence is heard and reviewed by department members who are colleagues of, and maybe even friends of, the person who wrote the initial ticket. Due process is about meaningful opportunity to be heard, but this adjudicative system is incredibly one-sided, and the proposed rule fails to ensure that the person who is incarcerated is able to effectively navigate the hearing and have their voices heard. And under the proposed rules, even where the charges for an infraction in the jail could result in criminal charges, people are merely informed by DOC that their statement could be used against them in a criminal trial. In this situation, despite the heightened severity of the consequences of such a hearing and the constitutional and due process consequences for criminal, family, immigration, or civil court, representation is not provided to help the individual navigate the hearing and decide whether to speak at the hearing and make a statement. In this context, the claim of impartiality is an empty one. But access to representation could correct for this imbalance, ensure a fairer process for individuals facing hearings, and create some semblance of due process throughout this process. For example, at a basic level, access to representation could ensure that people are actually notified of and brought to their hearings. An advocate could help people pull together or explain evidence and consider the consequences of a hearing. Access to representation would provide greater transparency and accountability, because despite their severe consequences on a person's liberty, these hearings happen within the jail's walls, beyond the view of the public, people's attorneys, and even the board. Having advocates at these hearings would provide some level of accountability just by having someone in the room who is not from the department. Finally, access to representation is feasible. This is not a new idea. It exists in other jurisdictions, including one where I previously worked while in law school. And when HALT goes into effect in a year, it will exist here. But the board has an opportunity to do this now. We fortunately live in a city with a robust network of public defender offices, all of which have offered to take on costs associated with providing representation to our clients in the jails. All we are asking is that you let us in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Perry. The next three persons are Eileen Maher, Victor Herrera, and Eugenie Montaigne. The first person is Eileen Maher.
Person's not in the room.
Okay, the next person is Victor Herrera.
The person's also not in the room.
The next person is Eugenie Montaigne.
My name is Eugenie Montaigne, and I'm an attorney in the criminal defense practice at Brooklyn Defender Services. Thank you for allowing me to comment on the rule today. I want to raise a few issues with the proposed rule and bring up Brooklyn Defender's overarching concern that this proposed rule amounts to solitary by another name. My main focus today will be on the essential freedoms that our clients are deprived of in the restrictive housing setting and how inhumane and akin to solitary confinement it is. Because of DOC's repeated inability to provide sufficient escorts within the jail, individuals who are placed in restrictive housing face the possibility that they will rarely be allowed to leave their cells. Even when they are technically leaving their cell, they will still be in a cage. According to the proposed rule, when people in level 1 have out of cell time, they are placed in another slightly larger cage alone. Similarly, when people in level 2 have out of cell time, they are in another cage with only 3 people who may or may not be in the same cage or in a separate nearby cage. No matter how many times this rule claims that there is out of cell time, the reality remains that our clients are in small cells, deprived of the freedom of movement that the term out of cell time is meant to connote. Another troubling aspect of the rule is that people may be held in this setting indefinitely. While the rules provide that people may be allowed to progress between levels, they allow people to be held indefinitely in level 1 based on a broad and vague documented intelligence that the person would engage in violence in level 2. This is troubling, inhumane, and undermines due process by not allowing people in a meaningful way to challenge potentially baseless allegations that they will engage in violence at some point in the future. One small protection, access to representation at these placement reviews, would help enormously. Because of the nature of restrictive housing, our clients and other incarcerated individuals will have to rely on DOC staff for almost everything. And as I noted earlier, given the repeated staffing issues in the jail, specifically with escorts, this could lead to our clients not receiving adequate medical and mental health care. As we are all well aware, mental health care is even more critical for individuals who are in the restrictive housing setting with very little access to outside support. A cell-side visit of an individual who is struggling with their mental health or physical health is not adequate. Many of our clients don't feel that they can speak freely in those settings, and many fear that the disclosure of sensitive health information could jeopardize their safety within the jail. If DOC actually wanted to improve safety within the jail, they would provide meaningful programming for everyone, including those in restrictive housing. The proposed rule is a deeply flawed attempt to put a Band-Aid on an issue that needs to be addressed meaningfully and thoughtfully. The programming options outlined in the rule are woefully inadequate. Because there is no requirement that the programming be congregate in nature, and because it allows for both in and out of cell, the programming could consist of someone filling out a worksheet alone in their cell for 4 hours and 59 minutes. Again, this does not go to the root of the issue and only exacerbates it further if individuals are left in a small cell alone for hours on end. Perhaps even more troubling, the rule would impose these punitive and inhumane structures without providing incarcerated people with adequate due process. Due process cannot be boiled down to notice, although the notice requirement here is certainly lacking. Instead, it needs meaningful access to justice, access to procedures that will ensure that our clients and other individuals understand what their rights are and have the tools to participate in a full and fair hearing anytime their liberty interests may be impacted. This includes the opportunity to present and review evidence and to call witnesses. The notice must also include specific information about the allegations so that people know and understand what they are accused of and can adequately prepare for hearings. One issue that we hear regularly is a lack of language access in the disciplinary process or otherwise. Our clients who do not speak English are often not given an interpreter.
Your time is up. I'm sorry.
Thank
You've
you.
gone beyond. Thank you. The next persons who are scheduled to speak are as follows: Harmony Seberg, Benny Basio, and Ashaki Antoine. The first person is Harmony Seberg.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, please begin.
Great, thank you. My name is Harmony Seberg. I'm a social work intern with Jail Services team at Brooklyn Defender Services. I meet with people in restrictive housing on a weekly basis, providing support and direct advocacy related to conditions and due process procedures. My comments today will focus on due process informed by the direct experiences of those in New York City DOC custody. Despite efforts to frame the proposed rules as progress, the board's proposed rules on due process merely codifies what is already the practice, neglecting to provide true protections for people in custody and failing to hold DOC accountable. Common issues I hear from people I visit in restrictive housing include the lack of written documentation and communication for their placement, and lack of willingness or urgency by the department to provide this documentation upon request. As is the practice now, when someone receives an infraction, the department is supposed to provide a written notice and inform them of their upcoming disciplinary hearing. This is assuming they have received the ticket in the first place. Far too often people report to our office that they didn't know there was a hearing ticket or disciplinary decision was made in their absence. I recently met with a man, Mr. B, who had no idea why he was placed in PSEG. He hadn't been provided an infraction ticket, was not notified of a disciplinary hearing, or provided with a disciplinary disposition. He was completely in the dark about the actions being taken against him by DOC, despite his numerous pleas for information. He asked correctional officers every day, and he was told he would have to wait. He expressed to me that he would feel different if he knew the reason for his placement, if he knew what he was being punished for, or how long he would be there. Mr. B was left to his own devices, his mind wandering to scenarios, trying to make sense of the situation, only exacerbating the emotional trauma any jail experience can have on a person. I recently met with another man, Mr. C. A few days after being transferred into restrictive housing, he was served with a ticket that alleged he had intentionally threw water on a CO. Mr. C explained to me that his unit had been sprayed with a chemical agent, and he was splashing water on his face to get the spray out of his eyes. Only when he was served a sentencing disposition of 30 days did he learn that DOC determined he had refused his hearing. Since he was not informed of or brought to his hearing, he was unable to argue his side of the story or review security footage to defend himself. He had his documented mental health issues, and they were greatly exacerbated while he was held in solitude for 23 hours a day. He told me his medications were no longer enough to manage his heightened emotional distress, and the lack of due process in his case had a very real psychological impact on Mr. C. And these are not individual one-off mistakes, but a systemic failure by the department to ensure people are afforded with due process protections. Now, the board's proposed rules acknowledges some of these concerns by requiring DOC to video refusals, but the rules do not go far enough to address the problem. The rule must allow for access to representation during disciplinary hearings. Access to representation will hold DOC accountable to ensure disciplinary hearings are taking place. The person was properly notified and was able to attend. People in custody and their advocates regularly report the department's misuse and abuse of power. The department's repercussions of being placed in restrictive housing are very serious. Experiences in any form of isolation can result in long-lasting or permanent psychological damage, and as we have seen tragically and repeatedly here on Rikers Island, even death. The disciplinary process lacks transparency and true accountability, and the board has an opportunity to provide people with the protections that have been repeatedly violated by the department. We implore this board to strengthen its rules on due process procedures and ensure everyone have access to representation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The next person is Benny Basio. COBA President Benny Basio.
That person's not in the room.
Okay. The next person scheduled to speak is Ishaki Antoine.
Good morning.
Good morning. Please begin.
Okay, my name is Asaki Antoine. I am the first citywide trustee of the Correction Benevolent Association, and I am also a correctional officer. The proposed rulemaking to end punitive segregation's core principles are one-sided, making it impossible for correctional officers to do their assigned duties, which is care, custody, and control. It absolutely lacks inmate accountability. The first principle, as it pertains to the proposed rulemaking, seeks to protect the safety and treatment, dignity and respect of inmates incarcerated and correctional officers who work in the facilities. Currently in the jails, slashing and stabbings have increased 16%, assault on correctional officers increased 15%, male-inmate violence increased 284%. Daily, correctional officers are splashed in the facial area with urine and feces. Where is the dignity and respect for these correctional officers? The mayor admitted publicly that the New York City correctional officers have a tough job and should be supported. The proposed rule making to end punitive segregation does not support the correctional officers who patrol the toughest precincts in New York City. The BOC and inmate advocates often speak of prohibiting restrictions and dehumanize or demean people in custody. Well, what about correctional officers or civilians who are dehumanized every day by these offenders? How do you propose restricting these daily acts of violence? Imagine being a victim of a vicious assault, which leads to permanent bodily disfigurement. The proposed penalty of 15 days, a maximum 60 days of inmates' restrictive movement, with good behavior while the victim, a correctional officer, an inmate, or civilian, suffers a lifetime of physical, emotional, and psychological scars. Every day that an assault occurs against a correctional officer, they are dehumanized. Where is the support for the rules to protect the uniformed personnel who work behind the gate? Where is the support for the victims? Have you taken into account the inmate's extensive assaultive history while incarcerated? A crime is a crime regardless to where it is committed, and the penalty imposed should share the same value. Let's talk about the proposed sanctions. Chapter 6-22 proposed rule clearly prohibits the automatic monetary fine to all guilty infractions only for destruction of city property. With inmates violating DOC rules, no accountability for broken rules, with many placed on the medical exclusion list, without the monetary deterrent, you empower the inmates to assault correctional officers even more. In addition, the reality that DOC property has more value than the correctional officers who are physically assaulted daily, and for the female officers who are groped and looked at as sexual prey, this is totally unacceptable, and you have to do better than this. Assaults, fighting, refuse to adhere count procedures, inmate demonstration, riots, disrupting institutional programs, escape, extortion, smuggling, drugs, stealing, possession of stolen property, acts of hate are all infractions that occur in the jails daily. Infractions with monetary penalty imposed are needed. Without this, you lose structure, security, and safety in the facilities. Keeping the monetary surcharge will illustrate accountability, real accountability. Based on the proposed rulemaking, it is clear that the security and safety in the jails is not a priority to those outside entities who are not directly affected. Your one-sided agenda has and will continue to put all lives in jeopardy. Correctional officers are mentally and physically abused every day. The proposed rulemaking does not reflect the appropriate accountability for violation of inmate rules. In essence, these rules has been catered to inmates and encourage an increase of assault of correctional officer. To the BOC, it is your responsibility to ensure a safe environment for inmates detained and also correctional officers who are working in a jail setting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Antoine. The next three persons scheduled to speak are Lucia Alonso, forgive me, Darren Mack, and Sergio de la Pava. The first person is Lucia Alonso. Please give me the correct pronunciation of your name.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great.
My name is Lucia Alonso. Good morning, members of the New York City Board of Correction, and thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Lucia, and I work with the Women's Community Justice Association, a nonprofit advocating for justice-impacted women, trans, and gender nonconforming people. While we commend the board's effort to address the inhumane practice of solitary confinement, the new proposed rules claim to end solitary, but actually perpetuate another version of indefinite isolation. The so-called risk management and accountability system still allows people to be held in conditions that are extremely restrictive and isolating. According to the proposed rule, when people in level 1 and RMAS have added cell time, they are placed in another slightly larger cage with only one other person who may or may not be in the same cage. This type of so-called out-of-cell time does not actually amount to out-of-cell time. It still involves being caged without meaningful human engagement. Psychological experts have found that isolation in a double occupancy cell does not allow for regular social interaction, and it can be just as psychologically devastating as other forms of solitary. Isolation in any form can lead to paranoia, hostility, and an increase of violence. The real harm of solitary is not what the cell looks like, it's the lack of human contact and engagement. In order for torture by solitary confinement to fully end, people need to have at least 14 hours of out-of-cell time per day, with access to meaningful human engagement and programs in spaces conducive for human beings to interact meaningfully. Limiting people's out-of-cell time does not address safety or violence concerns. Rather, it can increase the rates of violence and cause devastating harm. Evidence has shown that in addition to being more humane, what actually works to address violence are opportunities for real and meaningful human engagement and pro-social programming. You can separate someone from the general population without isolating them and denying them their basic human right of human interaction. Even if DOC actually gave 10 hours of out-of-cell time with the proposed rules, that means people would still be caged in their cell for at least 14 hours per day. Imagine being in a cage in a cell for 14 hours a day. Imagine being caged as a person who menstruates. As we speak, there are people sitting in solitary without any access to hygiene products. People who menstruate only receive a small supply of hygiene products. So if someone bleeds heavily or has a medical condition such as endometriosis, they are forced to sit in their own blood, and when they get their DOC clothes dirty, they'll be punished for damaging the facility's property. Imagine your loved one who menstruates being forced to sit in a cage with no one helping them. This is what happens on a daily basis inside your jails and prisons throughout New York, and it will continue if you do not fully end solitary confinement. These proposed rules perpetuate some of the worst parts of solitary, including allowing people to be chained and shackled. Isolation is torture. It is inhumane. It is harmful. It does not stop cycles of violence. It does not heal, nor does it correct. Punitive segregation must be fully eliminated and not simply be changed to a different name. The Board of Correction must adopt rules and guidelines that truly eliminate solitary confinement in a real and meaningful way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The next person is Darren Mack.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Please begin.
Good morning, Chair and all members of the board. My name is Darren Mack with Freedom Agenda, and I'm a member of the Jails Action Coalition, and I'm also a survivor of solitary confinement. I want to bring some attention to an issue with the proposed rules presented by the Board of Corrections that can be described as low-hanging fruit. So the proposed rules continue to allow isolation for conduct such as drug possession or the possession of tobacco. I urge, the board that you eliminate the possibility of someone being subjected to being punished with solitary confinement for the possession of drugs or tobacco products. People need healing, not punishment. People who possess drugs or tobacco are not threats to the safety and security of people detained or work in the facility. If there has been anyone incarcerated being sent to solitary confinement for drugs or tobacco within the past year, since there has been no visitations allowed to incarcerated people in the citywide jail system, then I suggest this board conduct an investigation to find out how those drugs are getting in. My first experience of solitary confinement on Rikers Island was at the age of 18 in '93, when the population was over 20,000 people. Along with several other fabricated charges, I was charged with an assault on staff. Now, reading the disciplinary report, you probably think that I deserved to be in solitary confinement. However, what actually happened was, after a dispute with the jail guard, I was isolated into a secluded area, and he struck me with a closed fist to my head. But I defended myself so well that I was able to neutralize the attack. Then several officers charged and handcuffed me and sent me directly to solitary confinement. I was charged with assault on staff. The hearing officer the hearing was overseen by a uniformed DOC staff who found me guilty as expected, and I spent months in solitary confinement. This was a time when there was no spotlight on what was happening on the inside like it is now. Just like police brutality occurs on the outside, it occurs on the inside, except there's no one to pull out their cell phone to take a video of the brutality by jail guards. Over 2 decades later, Robert Hinton, 28 years old, was hogtied, captured on video, placed in solitary confinement, and then savagely beaten by a goon squad captain and 5 jail guards. The 10-minute-long beating was allegedly not caught on camera because jail guards know all the blind spots to enact their violence. He suffered a broken nose and fractures to his vertebrae in the beatdown when he was in solitary confinement. Now, do you think he did not get a disciplinary ticket to put in solitary confinement? This is why I encourage this board to propose rules that provides access to counsel. Access to counsel. At most, people should have access to their own legal counsel or legal advocate for these hearings. At least for serious cases like when harm has occurred, a right to counsel or legal advocate should be mandated. As a survivor of solitary confinement, and on behalf of Freedom Agenda members who have experienced the torture of solitary confinement and their families, in coalition with the Jails Action Coalition and the Whole Solitary Campaign, we urge the board to strengthen the rules to reflect a more humane and just accountable system. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next person scheduled to speak is Sergio de la Pava.
Thank you. Thank you both for holding this hearing and also for the proposed changes that are welcome. My name is Sergio de la Pava. I'm the legal director of New York County Defender Services. We've represented thousands of clients in criminal court, thousands of clients who've ended up at Rikers Island. And our experiences talking to them has led us to an inescapable conclusion that unfortunately is not being adopted. And that's that we must abolish what is essentially state-sanctioned torture. And I believe that RMAS, while certainly a step in a positive direction, falls far short of abolishment. It's important to know, and I'll provide some data here from just our own internal investigation. It's important to know just how widespread the use of solitary confinement remains to this day, despite what would appear to be a societal recognition that change is required. So in the time period between March 1st of 2020 and March 1st of this year, despite a record low number of people in DOC custody, our office alone had 63 of our clients placed in punitive segregation, with a high of 67 days of, in the case of some of our clients, spent in punitive segregation. And this is a good time, of course, to remember that the vast majority of people housed on Rikers Island are pretrial detainees, meaning people who have not been found guilty of committing any crime. and yet they're being subjected to what we feel is essentially a torturous practice. What input did we, as their attorneys, have in the process? How were we able to attempt to mitigate damage or in some ways prevent it? Zero. The answer to that is zero, as you've been hearing repeatedly this morning. There is no access to counsel either under the current rules or under this new rule that's being proposed. There is no access to counsel for people who are placed in this kind of segregation, subjected to this process. And it's important to note that, as I said, since a majority of these people are pre-child 18, they do have attorneys already. They have attorney, they are represented, but the practicality of it is that as their attorneys, meaning in my office, we are simply not informed that this is happening in the vast majority of cases, but it's reported to us by our clients after the fact. It's a rather common occurrence, for example, to go to Rikers Island pre-pandemic, or to have a video conference set up, or to have a court date where your client is expected to appear, but then be told that because your client is in some kind of segregation, somehow the process has been interfered with and you will not be having access to your client. And that becoming the first time that you hear about this, or more often a family member reaching out saying your client feels they were dealt with unfairly and they are now in segregated housing, solitary confinement, with all the harm that entails. So I just want to echo certainly what some council members at the beginning of this hearing indicated. Council member Powers indicated, that it's unconscionable that there's not a limit on the amount of time that this can be imposed. That's certainly true. The council member that followed mentioned access to counsel. Access to counsel can serve in many ways as a cure for many of the issues that are being brought up, because an attorney who is steeped to the extent possible in the way the Department of Corrections operates, which is by no means an easy labyrinth to navigate, let me say that right off the bat, can help mitigate a lot of the
10
ills
more
that we're hearing
seconds,
about.
just, 10 more seconds.
So I just urge the court I'm sorry, not the court. I urge you all to please strongly consider building in an access to counsel, and we are more than willing and ready to fill that need. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next person is Rashenda Kramer, followed by Francis Jatelis Shapiro, and then Minister Victoria, Dr. Victoria A. Phillips, Ms. V. So Rashenda Kramer, that person with us? I don't see that person.
That person's not in the room.
Let's see, Francis Jatelis Shapiro. Yes, please raise your hand. Francis Jatelis Shapiro, please raise your hand. Okay.
I made Francis a panelist.
You unmute
Are you
her.
with us, Francis?
Francis was there.
To unmute myself.
There you are. Okay, please begin. Can you hear us?
Yes, I hear you. Can you hear me?
We can now. Please begin.
Okay. Thank you for allowing me to testify. I'm a psychologist with Physicians for Human Rights and also a member of the Halt Solitary campaign. In the introduction to your newly proposed rules, you say these proposed rules end the inhumane practice of solitary confinement, replacing it with a more humane alternative. Sad to say, if you approve these rules, you will accomplish neither of those claims that you make in this statement. As part of the Halt Solitary campaign, I'd like to make it clear that the actual name of our organization is the Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement. And the reason for that is that the damage that is attributed to solitary confinement is largely due to the extreme isolation, which is the source of the severe mental and physical harm, which is caused by a way in which you have been treating people in your custody. Solitary confinement is the most commonly named, but there are many others, like you use punitive segregation or enhanced supervision housing. And now you're planning to have this new RMAS to which you'll be subjecting vulnerable human beings. And once again, it's characterized by the torture of extreme isolation. So no matter what you claim, these new rules are not ending the practice of solitary confinement. It's clear if we examine the nature of the RMAS units, especially level 1, which you plan to hold individuals who are accused of being violent, but they're being held in a small cell and supposedly being given out of cell, but that's really just in an attached, slightly arduous cell in which the individual might or might not have a neighbor to whom he can talk. So where is the supposed out of cell time in which there's an opportunity to engage in meaningful social interaction and helpful programming? The individual is not actually being allowed either of these opportunities. The limited description we have of the units, because you have failed to provide pictures or draft models as requested, there's very little opportunity for genuine human interaction. And it makes it clear that it is simply another form of extreme isolation. This is solitary confinement with simply another name. To make matters worse, there's no clear limit to the time someone might stay in such a unit. At one of the required periodic reviews at which no legal representation is also required, someone can claim the individual is likely to be violent again in the future, and this will be sufficient basis for keeping him or her in isolation. It's not clear who gets to make such a claim or what foundation of knowledge or human understanding the claim is based on. So often we've heard formerly incarcerated people, as we have today, described how they were never told there was a hearing in which they could defend themselves, were never told there was, that we've heard people speak about how the officers report incidents very inaccurately, and therefore people are punished inappropriately. Why aren't you listening to this testimony and giving it appropriate weight? Given the problems with your new rules, as I've described, there's a strong likelihood that you will be continuing to torture the people in your custody and thereby causing the same psychological problems that
Move on to the next person. I apologize that we have to cut you off, but we do need to move to the next person. Thank you. All right, the next persons are Minister Dr. Victoria A. Phillips, followed by Kayla Simpson, and then Tiffany M. Dr. Victoria Phillips, Minister Phillips, good morning.
Peace and blessings. Can you hear me correctly?
Yes,
Okay,
good
now
morning.
I want to ask, like I always do, everyone mute yourself because the playback messes with my invisible disabilities. So right off the bat, I just don't want to waste no time. I'm Dr. V from founder of Visionary V, Jails Action Coalition member, Justice for Women Task Force, and many other coalitions. I just want to touch on some basic points. I don't have no real speech. The first point is Gary, the officer, he was correct. There's no consequences for bad behavior. And so I've testified for the last 10 years in front of this board directly on things occurring behind correctional walls. The last 8 years, I've testified on the record how officers also are gang members. I've even had my life threatened because of the things I've testified around officers being gang members. And not one of you board members ever questioned me about the things that I was bringing up in that matter. I first want to touch on programming. Programming has never been what the Adolescents and Young Adult Advisory Board created. Under Commissioner Brand's regime, her administration, in fact, has spent valuable time, even years, not providing any of the incentives, implementing any of the things that we created before COVID. And pre-COVID, officers always gave excuses on people not being able to get to programming for lack of escorts or facilitators not being allowed access to certain units to actually do the groups. Hold them accountable. Medical. What I could say is, yes, I agree anyone under 25 should not be in solitary, anyone over 55, but I have put on the record my medical. At 35, I had to have emergency brain surgery. So what would that look like behind y'all walls? Because on the outside, I had to advocate for myself over 8 times before someone did a basic test to find the mass in my brain. What would that look like behind the walls? And I wouldn't fall into any of the categories being said not to be placed in solitary. No one should be in solitary. That's my point. And I also want to say, I think it's disgusting, and that's why I'm speaking directly as me and no affiliations at all. I think it's disgusting that this board has 2, not 1, but 2 medical doctors, and yet we continue to see rules and variances around people being shackled. You know, medically, DOC and CHS does not do what they're supposed to do for people placed into DOC period, and yet you are proposing a rule to continue to shackle people and hold people indefinitely. So I want to ask you something. If the majority of people held in DOC were white, would we even have to have these hearings for these proposed rules? I don't think so. And legal representation. Are you serious? At a time when federal monitors have released not 1, but 10 reports on the failures of DOC admin when it comes to accountability, at a time when we have not 1, but 2 top positions of this board of melanin folks, I find it disgusting. And I think it personally is asinine and cowardly that any rules proposed with shackles and the lack of legal representation. Because as a Black or brown person leaving my house in New York City, I could easily be swept up by an officer looking to make a bus and then thrown into a system. And then based on liars, the federal monitor clearly told you, look, officers lie. But based on a lie, I could be thrown into a situation where I'm isolated and kept away from people, denied my basic rights, and then put into a level where I'm shackled and held indefinitely and not even allowed legal representation. This can't be domestic soil. This cannot be America. This cannot be the America my family has served for. This cannot be the America that my mother is buried in a military cemetery for. This is all based on white supremacy, and you can't tell me your rule doesn't tie directly into white supremacy and modern day slavery in 2021. Make it make sense. This does not make sense. We in solitary for 16 to 21-year-olds in 2014 and 2015. Y'all approved ESH. You will not do this again. Solitary must end. People die and lives are on the line. Step up and do your jobs. Step up and hold those titles that you hold dear. Step up. Step up. Peace and blessing.
Jennifer, you're muted.
For Dr. Phillips, forgive me. The next person is Kayla Simpson.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, thank you. Please begin.
Thank you. My name is Kayla Simpson on behalf of the Legal Aid Society's Prisoners' Rights Project. Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you. Of course, today represents years of work from this board, from advocates, and many other actors in the city. And I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that it's an important moment. And so it's important to remember that this rulemaking began over 5 years ago as a way to reimagine the way that New York City jails use isolation, how the department responds to violence, to disorder, to rule violations. Because the way that this department responds, defaulting to isolation and deprivation, does incredible harm to people, as is illustrated by so many of these comments. And what's more, it doesn't work. Throughout the years, data about violence, numbers of alarms, deployment of probe teams, use of force rates, they all tell the same story, that this department's responses are not creating safety for anyone, people in custody or staff. And that's why a reimagining was necessary. But that's not what these rules are. What we're seeing instead is a codifying of provisional, experimental measures like ESH or MDC-9 South and NIC that have painfully emerged over these last several years, experiments with documented failures. These rules combine the demonstrably unsuccessful ESH levels model with cruel physical structures. We know from the board's own reporting over 5 years what ESH's levels model creates. People languish in these units for months and years. They do not know how to get out. Their individual behavior plans are anything but individual. Programs are recommended to them to advance, but not actually offered to them. This model breeds frustration, desperation, unrest, and violence. It perpetuates trauma and then penalizes additional trauma responses. And then those rules marry that model to physical level 1 structures that our clients literally call kennels. So-called cell, out of cell door cage, outside of a cage. No congregate activity, no opportunities for real programming, except through plexiglass and a narrow corridor, if at all. And then there's the potential to be there indefinitely, requiring only intelligence about future violence from the department. The system does not protect against the central harms of isolated confinement. It does not resemble the project we all started. It's a doubling down on experiments that did not work. And I have to emphasize that operational failure part of this. We've seen failures in basic implementation in Nunez. You see it in your own reporting about ESH. You see it in the now decimated young adult plan. You've seen it in the way that minimum standards are treated like the ceiling and not the floor. Complex systems relying on this department's discretion are proven disasters, unconstitutional ones, and they carry a price tag of minds and bodies. And it's why we need stronger, more specific rules. We need hard durational limits for how long someone can be kept in these levels. We need access to counsel in these infraction and review hearings to shine some daylight in dark corners. We need actual clarity on how people can advance through these levels. And we need a plan for how to truly provide accountability for this accountability system, which experience shows us will be steeped in impunity. It will, we know it. We'll submit extensive written comments this week. We would truly welcome ongoing discussions about the specifics with the board about how to make this better. And we're very glad that we have a draft to consider. That's an important step forward so that we can have these conversations. But I think we all know that this work is not nearly finished. So let's please take the time to make these changes that will get this right, because we must do better than this for everyone in the jails and for the people who love them. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Simpson. Very much appreciated. The next person to speak is Tiffany M. Is Tiffany M with us? Yes. Please raise your hand.
I've made Tiffany a panelist, so they should be able to unmute.
Please unmute. Tiffany M., please unmute and begin speaking. Okay. I believe that Benny Basio, COPA President Basio, is here. And we called on him before. He wasn't here in the moment, but we will call on him now if he is still here. Benny Basio, please raise your hand. Bennett, please elevate him to panelist.
Yeah, give me 1 second.
Okay, Mr. Basio, you can unmute yourself and speak.
Good morning. Can
Good
everybody hear
morning. We can hear you. Please begin.
So I had technical difficulty this morning when I was trying to log in. Usually I have written testimony, and I'm not gonna read from my written testimony. I just want to speak. I've been attending these board of correction meetings or watching the rerun of them for quite some time, and the reality is that the jails are understaffed. Assaults continue to rise. And in 8 years, this administration has not been able to quell violence. The department is housing gang affiliation, which is making even inmates even more emboldened in their actions against officers. And I continuously hear the advocates advocating for the people that are committing these violent acts. But who is advocating for the inmates that are on the other side of that slap? Who is on the other side of that assault? Who's advocating for those individuals? Because the reality is that we want everybody to be safe in our facilities, but there are a small population of inmates that, no matter what is done, they do not change their behavior. And the question is, what do we do with that small population of inmates that continues to terrorize and assault and does not change behavior? We have to have punitive segregation in place to be able to separate violent inmates from non-violent inmates. There has to be consequences. It's hypocritical for us as a society to say we need jails, right? If you commit a crime, if somebody approaches you in the street and punches you in your face or cuts you in the subway, what do we do with that individual? That individual is put in jail. Punitive segregation is a jail within a jail, and we need tools to make everybody safe. And I'm willing to tour with any of the BOC board members, any of the advocates that want to really see what's going on, because there's this false narrative out there about us, about we're constantly demonized as correction officers, that there's no due process for inmates. We have thousands of cameras in our system. In our jails, there are thousands of cameras in our system where you can see the violence, where you can see the unprovoked attack from some of these inmates. And this is the reality of what we're going through. I fight to have more correction officers because we're understaffed, and inmates are being affected because we're understaffed. Yes, inmates are not getting their minimum standards and the programs that they should be getting. And yes, that is contributing to the violence, and housing them by gang affiliation has emboldened them, and these watered down consequences for them have even made them more emboldened because nothing's happening to them. They're assaulting us with impunity and nothing is happening. And we have to have these tools in place, not just to keep us safe, but to keep inmates safe as well. And I think that is missing from this equation. Nobody wants to talk about the inmate that's getting hurt, that just wants to go to jail and do their time. Because the department has decided to house by gang affiliation, you got 50 bloods in a house. So if you're an inmate that are not gang affiliated, guess what happens to you when you come to Rikers Island? You have to be forced to join a gang. And I'm just, look, this false narrative that's out there, yes, do we have officers that sometimes go above and beyond and use excessive force? Yes. But try through getting feces and urine thrown in your face. Try to be spit on your face. Try to be punched in the face, cut. Is it not torture to go around and walk with a scar on your face? Female
President
officers.
Basio, let me just interject and tell you, I'm giving everybody 4 minutes and 30 seconds. So you have another 15 seconds.
I appreciate the time, Miss Austin. I appreciate the time. But that's what I think is missing. And I felt like this system has been rushed, and we need more time to have meaningful discussions with the advocates, with the Board of Corrections, just so that we can really have meaningful, safe change in the jails. Thank you for your time, for my time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Very much appreciated. Let us now return to the slate and hear from the following persons. Is Tiffany M. here yet? The persons that follow Tiffany M. are Irene Sedano and Claudia Forrester, and then fourthly, Naomi Schmidt. Is Tiffany M. with us? Okay. I still see her as a panelist. Tiffany, you can unmute and begin speaking if you're with us.
I'm going to unmute Tiffany briefly and see if they're there.
Tiffany? Okay. Let's move on to Irene Sedano.
Sorry, one second. I think, Tiffany, are you there? No, I thought we had it in for a second. All right.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. Irene Sedano?
Hi,
Please
can you all
begin.
hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Irene Sedano, and I'm a jail services advocate at Brooklyn Defender Services. For years, survivors, family members, and advocates have been calling for the end to solitary and torture by isolation in our city jails. This board has heard countless stories from those directly impacted who bear their trauma publicly to ensure not one more person will be harmed. This board is not ending solitary confinement, but instead perpetuating the worst practices of extreme isolation and calling it reform. This is solitary by another name. My comments today will focus on the failures of the board's rule to provide meaningful congregate engagement during out-of-cell time. Specifically, RMAS Level 1, being the most restrictive, confines people to a cell and an adjacent cage for at least 23 hours a day, completely by themselves without any meaningful interaction with others. As written, the proposed rule requires that people shall engage, and I quote, both visually and orally, and in a setting where people can converse without needing to raise their voices to be heard. This language gives the department the leeway to satisfy any meaningful out-of-cell time requirements without ever letting the person out of a cage, as long as they can see and hear others. No reasonable person could describe this as a congregate setting nor meaningful interaction. This is solitary by another name. No one can question the critical role meaningful out-of-cell time plays in preventing decompensation and ensuring the most basic level of safety for people who are isolated in restrictive housing. Medical professionals, security experts, human rights scholars, and advocates have all stressed that people in isolation must have access to out-of-cell time and that this time must be meaningful. Despite the fallacies this board is purporting, the proposed design for RMAS Level 1 and Level 2 prevent people from any meaningful out-of-cell time. I have spoken to several people who have been in the current restrictive units at NIC and the secure unit at GRVC, models for RMAS Levels 1 and 2, and repeatedly horrific conditions are described, conditions perpetuated by the department and emboldened by this board. We recently represented a man who was held in the restrictive unit at NIC. Anytime he was allowed to leave his cell, presumably for mandated out-of-cell time, he was only allowed to go a few feet out of his physical cell into an adjacent cage area no bigger than the cell. He described the experience as extremely isolating and having contributed to his declining mental health. In the secure unit, people have described being alone in the cage and their only interaction was when they sat on the floor so they could effectively hear the person in a cage across the divider. Literal barriers of plexiglass and hard metal fencing prevent people, especially young people, from engaging in meaningful stimulation that is critical to counteracting the torture that will come with these proposed RMAS units. These are facts already known, and our office has continuously reported these cases to the board. Board staff have reported on the extreme isolation and the impacts these barbaric structures have on individuals, yet your proposed rules ignore the realities and celebrate the department's failings. The board has an opportunity to truly bring change to the department's use of restrictive housing to address behavior without committing to punitive measures while ensuring the physical and mental welfare of all people in the jails. This rule does not do that, but instead it solidifies the city's use of solitary by another name. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And the next person scheduled to speak is Claudia Forrester.
Morning, can you hear me?
Yes, please begin.
Good morning, I'm Claudia Forrester and I'm a jail services advocate at BDS. On a weekly basis, I hear from incarcerated people who share their experiences from inside the New York City jails. It's their stories that guide my concerns related to programming in the proposed RMAS units. The board's proposed rule lacks specificity and allows DOC to make arbitrary determinations. History has repeatedly shown us that without specificity, there is no accountability and there are no protections. Specifically, when it comes to programming in the RMAS levels, there are numerous questions that remain unanswered. 1, how will programming be facilitated within levels 1 and 2? Since the rule makes no mention of designated program areas for congregate and meeting interaction, it's our understanding that people will be confined to their cell and cage, and program staff may only walk the corridor. 2, there is no clear definition of participation, which leaves DOC to make that determination, the very same determination that will be used to prevent an individual from progressing out of that unit. 3, the rule states that programming will be 5 hours of both in and out of cell time, without requiring a minimum out of cell time. This means DOC can confine a person to their cell for 4 hours and 59 minutes, and that will be considered adequate. 4, what will accountability look like when DOC makes any of these arbitrary determinations? As written, without any clear definitions, programming can be a worksheet that a person has to complete isolated in their cell while DOC determines if that person has adequately participated in order to progress to the next level. Under this rule, people will languish in these units indefinitely and decompensate as they are isolated without any meaningful interaction. This is dangerous, counterproductive, and will not address the purported violence that DOC claims as evidenced in their push for these units. Meaningful programming is essential for combating idleness, yet what's being proposed goes against everything that we know works. Mr. A has been in and out of solitary for years. During a recent visit, he informed me that he is now receiving dialectical behavior therapy and described the immense benefits, sharing, "These emotional skills I'm learning have changed my whole outlook. It's changing the way I interact with other guys and with COs too." The part that Mr. A describes as so enriching was the meaningful time with other people. He described discussing the material with other individuals and practicing the skills they learned together on days they didn't have programming. He said, "I feel like I formed real connections for the first time in here. I now have other guys who would know to check me in a positive way if I start to get in my head again. The programming has really helped me with my mental state, helping me to calm down and remember that everyone in here is just trying to live their lives. This is the first positive thing to come out of my time here." The immense benefits Mr. A received from DBT programming would not be possible under the proposed rule. Trying to participate in programming while sitting in a cage separated from staff and other participants by plexiglass and hard metal fencing is not meaningful engagement. When asked if the progress Mr. A had made would have been possible if he and other participants were in separate cages, he answered, "Not a chance. The only way this works is by connecting with other people and being able to open up. No one can do that if they're being treated like an animal." Ending solitary isn't just about what the cell looks like. It's about meaningful engagement and creating an environment for pro-social behavior. This rule fails to end solitary and instead perpetuates the harm under a different name. The lack of specificity in the proposed rule is dangerous, and BDS calls on the board for strict and specific standards, because without it, there are no protections for people confined to the city jails. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Forrester. The next person to speak is Naomi Schmidt, followed by Zakia Workino, and Reverend Markeisha Jackson. Naomi Schmidt, please begin. You're in the panelist. You're unmuted. You can begin.
Thank you. Good morning. I am an NYU law student, and I will read the testimony of a man who has been in solitary confinement and restrictive housing for the past 6 months. I grew up in New York City and I have been in and out of incarceration for the last 20 years. I have been incarcerated in almost every NYC DOC facility. I have been in DOC custody for almost 2.5 years. I was placed in solitary for an infraction in October 2020. In solitary, there's only 1 hour of recreation per day, but officers threaten that they're going to search your cell if you take the hour, so many people don't even take it. People in solitary are always shackled, even when showering. The shackles make me feel like I'm an animal. The isolation and the dehumanization have messed with my head. If I were a suicidal person, I would have killed myself a long time ago. After 30 days in solitary, officers placed me in enhanced supervision housing instead of general population housing, where I should have gone. In ESH, people are locked in their cells for 17 hours a day. Even in the 7 hours a day that I can be out of my cell, I'm shackled. We're all just inside of cages like dogs. After completing 90 days in ESH, people are supposed to go to general population housing. However, despite completing the 90 days under enhanced supervision, I never got to go to general population housing. Instead, I was transferred to GRVC and I was put in solitary confinement again, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. The officers fabricated an infraction as an excuse to put me back in solitary. The officers here regularly give me tickets for things I haven't even done, just to rack up my points and worsen my punishments. I believe they are doing this to target me because they remember me from the last time I was housed at DRBC. Even outside of solitary, life at Rikers leaves me physically and mentally unsafe. I suffer from asthma, which is a COVID-19 risk factor. Despite this, when I had an asthma flare-up at OBCC during the pandemic, it took me 4 days to be brought to medical. Whenever I have a medical issue, it takes me a very long time to receive any health services. This has gotten even worse since my transfer to GRVC. While here, an officer attacked me and I ended up with bruising and cuts on my arms. They don't want medical to see my injuries, so they are not letting me receive any treatment for them or any other medical issues. The mental health services are also extremely inadequate. I only have the opportunity to speak to counselors once a month. These monthly meetings occur in the housing area, which means that other people are always within earshot. Because of the lack of privacy, I don't feel comfortable speaking openly with the counselors, which prevents me from getting the mental health services that are supposed to be provided. On top of this, the counselors aren't really trying to provide meaningful sessions. They only ever ask whether my medication is working. I don't trust mental health counselors anymore. They don't actually care about me. The COVID-19 pandemic has worsened life on Rikers in many ways. First, improper pandemic procedures leave me feeling unsafe, especially given my asthma. The surfaces in the jail are not regularly sanitized the way they're supposed to be. I haven't had a court date, virtual or in person, in 15 months, supposedly because of the pandemic. The DOC is also preventing me from seeing the discovery related to my indictment. I had my discovery several months ago, but the law library claims they lost it when I was transferred to OBCC. This is making it more difficult for me to fight my case. I also have not been allowed to use the law library as a result of the coronavirus. There have been issues with my mail, and I haven't been able to have visits due to COVID. Again and again, correctional officers are using the pandemic as a way to refuse to give us the services that we deserve. It's easy to feel hopeless. Between the cruelty of restrictive housing, the denial of services, and inadequate COVID-19 safety, I don't know what to do. I'm tired of complaining, but it's also inhumane. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Schmidt. And we will now hear from Zakia Workano. Zakia Workano. You are unmuted and can begin speaking. Are you there, Zakia? Okay. We will move on to Reverend Markeisha Jackson, followed by Lionel Cumberbatch, and then Barfera Leto. Reverend Markeisha Jackson, you're unmuted and can begin speaking. Reverend Markeisha Jackson, if you're there, you can begin speaking.
I think she might be having trouble with the audio.
We can see you, but we can't hear you, Reverend. I'll email you a call-in number.
Okay,
it
and then
seems
we'll
my
move on
phone's
and we'll
wrong.
come back to you. The next person is Lionel Cumberbatch. I don't know if Lionel Cumberbatch is.
That person's in the room.
Okay. Rafael Leto. I don't know if that person is in the
That
room.
person's not in the room either.
Jennifer Parrish, Richard Sarno, and Julia Davis. Jennifer Parrish, please raise your hand. You can just unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself and you can begin. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. My name is Jennifer Parrish, and I'm the Director of Criminal Justice Advocacy at the Urban Justice Center Mental Health Project and a member of the Jails Action Coalition and the Halt Solitary campaign. I'll provide substantive comments on the proposed rule in writing and at tomorrow night's hearing. But today I'm testifying to note my concern regarding the lack of transparency in this rulemaking process. The board has failed to provide the public with notice regarding the design of the risk management and accountability system housing units that will be the product of this rule. In its statement of basis and purpose for the rule, the board specifically states that DOC plans to expand the structurally restrictive housing units at NIC as the design for level 1, and it notes that the secure unit at GRVC will be expanded for level 2. These are specific units that exist currently. Yet the board has thus far refused to provide the public with any information about the floor plan of these units or any photos of these units. How can you expect the public to provide comment on meaningful engagement in these units without this information? It seems clear to me that the board recognizes that the meaningful engagement which you claim can occur on these units is laughable, in reality not meaningful at all. It appears that the board does not want the public to see exactly what it's encouraged the department to replicate, that these units are not some advance in human rights, but instead the perpetuation of an extremely punitive and harmful system. Board members are quick to say how limited the board's power is, what you cannot force the department to do. Yet here you are with your own rulemaking process, and you have chosen to hide from the public what you are promoting through these rules. One thing that this board has the power to do is to promote transparency, yet you've chosen not to do so. Now, I hope I'm wrong about this. I hope that you live up to your commitment, which the chair stated at the beginning of this meeting, to provide renderings of these units tomorrow. However, this is inadequate. It's too little, too late. By then, you will have had a day of hearings in which none of the speakers have had access to this information. It is not as though this request for information just came to your attention. On March 25th, almost 3 weeks ago, the Jails Action Coalition and the HALT campaign sent you a letter making the request for this information. Yet you're holding this hearing today without giving the public notice of the design of the RMAS units. Why could DOC not provide these renderings last week or even yesterday? Why do you allow the department to delay in providing this information? This is your rulemaking process. Frankly, it's just another stain on this terribly flawed process, which was delayed through the creation of an unnecessary working group, which continued with a lack of transparency regarding the working group's recommendations, which have never been shared with the public. And now, through hiding the design for units which you claim will provide meaningful engagement and will not be another form of isolation and punishment. You should provide transparency now. Show us that RMAS is not just solitary by another name. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And all can refer to the beginning of the transcript for information about how we are handling the renderings and the request, the FOIL request for the photos. We have been in conversation with the Department of Correction and have been taking into consideration some of the concerns that have been raised by advocates, as well as concerns raised by the Department of Correction concerning the security issues that they believe may present. Nonetheless, notwithstanding, renderings will be made available, and the issue of photos is being addressed as well. Let's move on to the next people. Let me just say that I thought it important just to bring that up so people who have not tuned in earlier would be aware of how we are handling this matter. The next person scheduled to speak are Richard Sarno, Julia Davis, and Kelly Grace Price. Beginning with Richard Sarno.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please begin.
Thank you very much to the board for allowing me the opportunity to speak. I originally wasn't going to, but I just wanted to add, in response to the advocates who are pushing to end punitive segregation, I beg you to consider that there are incarcerated individuals or inmates that are abusive and assaultive and violent. And in some cases, that's all they know. We move them from one area to the next and they just continue to be violent, whether it's against staff or other incarcerated individuals. And I would ask you, what would you have us do with them? How would you have us, what tools would you give us to provide safety to the other individuals around them, whether they're civilians or uniformed staff or other inmates? How can we possibly justify allowing this individual to go into a housing area knowing that he's going to be violent towards the other individuals in that area? How can we justify that to the families of the people that this individual hurts? We absolutely need a tool or a set of tools to enable us to maintain safety for everybody involved. I don't have a whole lot more to say. I appreciate everybody's information and point of view. I just wanted to have that point considered. With that, I'm sorry for the lack of introduction. My name is Richard Sarno. I'm a correction officer. And have a great day. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Sarno. Very much appreciate your testimony. The next person we will hear from is Julia Davis.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please begin.
Thank you. Chair and board members, thank you for listening so actively to the presentations today and what I imagine will continue tomorrow. We will be submitting written comment. My name is Julia Davis. I'm the Director of Youth Justice and Child Welfare at the Children's Defense Fund in New York, and I've testified before this board since 2014. I was formerly a member of the department's Young Adult Advisory Board, which has been mentioned multiple times today, which sadly is no longer active. My written comment will address the entire proposed rule. I want to focus on a couple of things today as they relate to young adults. So, as you've heard me say before, and as many of you have committed to in terms of your work on the board, young adults are entitled to very specific age-appropriate protections under the rules. And that was very intentional, based on literally months and months of investigation, research, testimony that came from experts really from across the country in 2015. And what we have here in the proposed rules, frankly, are very restrictive settings for 18 to 21-year-olds, things that have been described today as cages. And what we also have been seeing in these rules is that there is no limit on the number of days and the amount of time that 18 to 21-year-olds, this special group of young people, based on all of the science we've discussed before, are going to be subject to this type of restrictive housing. As a note, we could not possibly do this with young people who are a day younger at Horizon and Crossroads. We could not do this with young people 18 to 21 adjudicated in the adult system who are in OCFS facilities. So the fact that we have rules here that are so inconsistent with what we know is true and necessary about young people is frankly startling, considering where we are in this process. I'll note to you that what we've heard from correction officers today, including that services, programming are not reaching people.
Hold on one second, please,
that increases in
I'm just going to pause for a second. Hold on.
It's because of the things that Caleb said.
Is everyone able to hear her? Okay, we've lost her. If she comes back, we'll pick up where she left off. She is submitting written testimony as well, so we will have that. But if she comes back, we'll give her the remainder of her time. The next person to speak is Miss Kelly Grace Price.
That person's not in the room.
Okay. The next person scheduled to speak are Akeem Browder, McIntyre Ledane, and John Smith. Akeem Browder, is that person in the room?
None of those people are here right now.
I'm sorry, it seems is Julia Davis with us again? No, okay. Trying to come in. I see her picture, but she seems frozen.
Not gonna be able to testify.
I would recommend turning off the video, and you might be able to hear you better, Julia. Chair, none of the three people just called are in the meeting right now.
Okay. The next person scheduled to speak are John Smith, Ignor Singh, Victor Pate, and Peter Martinez. John Smith, is John Smith with us?
No.
Okay. Ignor Singh?
No, I do see there are a number of people that are called in on the phone right now. If any of these people want to speak, they need to email me at bstein@boc.nyc.gov, B as in boy, STEIN B as in boy, OC.nyc.gov, so that we can know what phone number they're calling from.
Okay. Victor Pate?
That person's not in the room.
Peter Martinez. Martinez.
Good afternoon, board member. Martinez here.
Good afternoon. Please begin.
First and foremost, thank you for allowing a platform for both the public and for DOC to pretty much voice their opinions. I myself am a New York City correction officer. I've been with the department for about 16 years. I was reading over the proposed policies, and I just have a few questions. Proposed Rule 6-10, subsection 8 states, grade 1, violent offenses include violent conduct such as a stabbing or slashing or assault of a person causing serious injury. So now if a uniformed staff member or civilian gets spat on, is that considered a grade 1 offense?
I'm not really sure. I have to look at the particulars. And so we will just take note of that, what you're asking.
Okay, and just to continue furthermore, the reason why I asked is because my wife is also in this department.
Okay.
And she also works hand in hand with an inmate, and she recently got spat on in the face. She said if it wasn't for her mask or her glasses, it would have went in her eyes. So I understand all aspects. I know you guys have a very, very hard job to do because you're hearing the advocates, you're hearing the inmates, and I know our voice is not very loud. I've been watching this meeting since this morning. I've heard a lot of advocates, a lot of former individuals speak on behalf of inmates, but I implore you to see the conditions yourself firsthand. You guys are very vital in our operations. I know you're hearing opinions from all sides, but just please come in firsthand, see what we deal with. I've never seen it this bad. My wife herself has never been spat on until recently, and she's traumatized. So the issues the inmates face, PTSD, depression, correction officers, civilians that work in the correction field, we deal with the same issues. So I understand you guys have a job to do in solitary confinement, but please just keep our safety in mind, because we're getting hurt in here. We're getting hurt. We're going home with black guys. We all got families. We all got kids. We all want to walk in the same way we walked out. So just please keep us in mind. That's all I ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, and appreciate your testimony. Appreciate the testimony of everybody today. I'm told that Zakia Workano may be on the line and able to join us at this point. Is Zakia with us, Bennett?
believe so. I was told that there was a mic issue and it was fixed. But it seems like there might still be a mic issue. I will email the call number.
Okay. Is Julia Davis back with us?
I don't believe so. She said she'll follow up with her written comment.
Okay. We'll hold for another minute to see if we can get Zakia or Kano back. As we do, I'll just remind those who are still with us that you can submit your written comments to boc@boc.nyc.gov, boc@boc.nyc.gov, or mail them to 1 Century Street, room 2213, New York, 10007. Need to receive your comments by this Friday, April 16th. And you may also call the voicemail box. That number again is 212-669-7900, 212-669-7900. Press option 2 when prompted to do so. Is Zakia with us?
I just sent the call-in number. Chair, I think we should read through the names of the folks that we missed the first time around. Make sure anyone didn't join us.
Okay. 5, Milam Eek, forgive me.
Not here.
Clayton Jamat, Kenwin Richards, Jules Sam, Kev Alex, Nicole Valentine, Sandra Sweet Novelties, Alice Sturm Sutter, Jordan Rosenthal, Eileen Mayer, Victor Herrera, Rashenda Kramer, Reverend Markeisha Jackson, Lionel Cumberbatch, Rafael Leto, Kelly Grace Price, Akeem Browder, McIntyre Ladane, John Smith, Ignore Singh, and Victor Pate.
Victor Pates joined us.
Pate, forgive me. Victor Pate, are you with us? Victor Pate.
Oh, yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me now? I'm sorry.
Yes, please begin.
All right, thank you so much. Apologies, I was in another one. So my name is Victor Pate. I'm one of the organizers with the Halt Solitary Confinement Campaign, as well as a healing survivor of solitary confinement myself. And I'd first like to start off with saying thank you for allowing me to give this testimony. Always start off with what I point to is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which basically points to the standard minimum rules of the treatment of people in our prisons and jails. We're basically focusing on the part that relates to no one being subjected to any torture, abuse, or any inhumane treatment. And it is also applicable to the UN General Assembly Standard Minimum Rules, which is now known as the Mandela Rule, that was ratified in 2015. And we as a society are tasked with the humane treatment of our fellow human being in our prisons and jails. And it is sad and shameful and even criminal in some instances, the treatment that our human beings receive in our prisons and jails as it relates to their treatment and also being placed in solitary confinement. I can tell you as a healing, and I always say healing person of solitary confinement who served over 15 years in our New York State prisons and jails, but it's really sad and it hurts my heart to know that over the 25-year period previously, after being held as a prisoner on Rikers Island, also being placed in solitary confinement, that even since that period of time, not only has there been no changes, but it's even worse now than it was then. And I'm a product of the 70s of incarceration. And you would think that from the period of time of 1970 up until where we are in 2021, that the situation would have changed. Sadly and unfortunately, it has not. And it is even worse now than it was then before. So I say to you, as a person of faith, as a person, as a human being, that, you know, it is sad that we have to keep coming back time after time after time after time again to talk to and about the abuses, to hear of the horror stories that are happening to our fellow human beings, from those of us that have survived it to the families of those that are killed in the custody of the Department of Corrections, not only in the state, but also in the city. It is reprehensible that we have to be where we are right now and that we are still going back and forth with this conversation. But I submit to you that now is the time to stop talking and start doing, that we have to really pay attention to the people, and it is we, the people, that have to be responsible for making changes, but also have to be responsible for the people that are under our care. If it's supposed to be about Department of Corrections, then it should be about corrections, and it should not be about punishment. It should not be about abuse. It should not be about causing people to become incapable of functioning when they return to our communities and to our families and to our society, which is what happens as a result of people being placed in solitary confinement. So I say to you, each and every one of you, that you have the ability, you have the power to change. From the stories that you heard, from those of us who have been directly impacted and affected by solitary confinement, then you must know deep within your soul that solitary is no good. It should not happen, and people should not be placed under these circumstances or treatment in any shape, form, or fashion. And I implore you to do the right thing by people. And I thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, Mr. Pate. Very much appreciated. Is Zakia Workino with us?
Yes, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, please begin.
Okay, good morning. My name is Zakia Workino. I'm a social work intern at the Bronx Defenders. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. Today I share testimony on behalf of a 20-year-old youth whom I will refer to as Mr. Smith, currently held in Enhanced Supervision Housing, ESH, and who endured 5 months in the secure unit at GRVC, currently proposed as the model for the new RMAS Level 2. Mr. Smith's story highlights the complete lack of fact-checking or transparency in disciplinary process, as well as the utterly inhumane conditions in the secure unit. Mr. Smith has spent the majority of his current incarceration in restrictive housing units, the better part of 2 years. It all started because of a DOC error when, believing his age to be 25 instead of 18, DOC incorrectly placed him in punitive segregation. His legal team helped him file an appeal, but he ultimately won. But unfortunately, at that point, it was too late. Our client quickly learned that there was nothing fair or just about the disciplinary process at Rikers. In September, he first appeared for a hearing after an alleged infraction where an officer explained he would be placed in secure housing for a qualifying offense. During the hearing, an adjudication captain stated, "Officer X can say anything. They can say whatever they want. They can be totally wrong." Mr. Smith shares that in his experience, Whatever they write on the ticket, that's what they're going to go by. If it was an incident with footage, then they play it in front of you. If there's no footage, the CO can just write anything. The amount of blind spots in the housing area where there is no video to capture what actually happened means it is often only the officer's word, and incarcerated individuals' perspectives of events are not valued or heard. The week he would have leveled up to leave secure detention and return to general population, he was accused of allegedly smuggling contraband through a package that a family member sent him directly from Amazon. Although the package never went to the family member or our client, providing no opportunity to tamper with it, the false allegation alone resulted in the client returning to level 2 and more time insecure. Later, he was informed by officers that he should not have been penalized while there was a pending investigation. This is a crystal clear example of why DOC cannot be responsible for conducting periodic reviews with zero insight. Lastly, prior to his current placement in ESH, Mr. Smith did not receive any notice that explained why he was moved there and not back to general population. He never had a placement hearing, a critical missed opportunity to advocate for himself to return to general population. He remains upset because, in his words, they didn't give me a chance to fight. With no understanding or hope of ever leveling out of secure housing, our client feels like he has a dark cloud over his head. With regard to conditions, Mr. Smith describes the secure cells. Some cells don't have food slots, so the officers have to slide the food under the cell door. Then crickets and bugs fall in the food.
I
Another
have to bring
issue
your
that
testimony to a close because I let you go beyond the time as I did other people. Please submit the remainder of your testimony. Very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have, I believe, unless there are other persons to have joined us, Bennett, we have completed the list of persons who signed up to testify and who then showed up and did testify. Is that correct?
I believe that's right. I just want to try unmuting Reverend Jackson to see if
Okay.
Reverend Jackson, are you with us? Seems that the Reverend's mic's not working still.
Okay. Reverend Jackson can sign up for tomorrow evening if necessary, correct? Or
That's
this
right.
person would so like. Okay. The board will hold a second public hearing tomorrow evening, and it will be chaired by the hearing will be chaired by Vice Chair of the Board, Stanley Richards. It will begin tomorrow, April 14th, 2021 at 6 p.m. The board's next public meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, May 11th, 2021 at 9 a.m. These meetings are being held via WebEx. Details are available on our website, and as we always do, we'll send an email to interested parties. That being the case, this hearing is now officially adjourned. Thank you very much. I do see that Reverend Markeisha Jackson has joined us.
Yes,
Um,
I do apologize for
hold
all
on.
of the inconvenience.
No worries. All of the board members, I don't know if all of the board members are here, but I will reopen the hearing so that we can hear your testimony. And so I am going to reopen the public hearing to allow us to hear from you, Reverend Markeisha Jackson. You have 4 minutes, and please begin.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for all for hosting this testimonial to hear the things that need to be done and completely transformed within our criminal justice system, starting with our youth. Isolated confinement, yes, it has been in the progress of elimination. And to continue to do that, we need to address the mental health issues that are being diminished onto our children. It starts there. This is the reason why we're here, and it hasn't been addressed. There's no reason that any human being, regardless of age, be placed into isolated confinement for more than 24 hours. There is no reason that anyone that is mentally a health challenge to be placed in isolated confinement, shackled. When you have mental health issues and they are not addressed, that becomes a problem. The Department of Corrections, the Board of Corrections, they all understand from testimonies after years of advocates, psychologists, medical professionals, even the employees that are in the Department of Corrections. They talk about the safety that is needed amongst the individuals, whether it be employees or the incarcerated. The safety levels, if the mental illnesses and mental disabilities are not changed and transformed and addressed, no one within the facility will be able to balance. I got in this fight because my son, at the age of 17, qualified for his YO, a youthful offender, never had a record. A judge said no, he doesn't need rehabilitation. He needs punishment. And I hear that terminology being utilized often. Punishment, punishment, punishment. We don't need punishment. We need healing. We need restoration. How can a person be better if they are not restored? How can a person be better if they are not healed? When it comes to sicknesses and diseases, if you are not healed and restored, you diminish. And it happens in the same way in the incarceration system. They are human beings. They deserve life. And there are too many lives that have been lost because of terminology changes, adjustments. But we have real alternatives. We have real solutions because the system has been going for years, and nothing has changed to a positive level. And when we implement the programming that should be inside of the prison system, it can adjust. It can alleviate, because that's an alternative to anger. That's an alternative to frustration. That's an alternative to violence. It will reduce because there's other programming. There is other interaction that is taking place from a mental point of view that is positive for restoration and not punishment. The terminology has to transform, as well as our criminal justice system is transforming. Terminology has to transform. We can't keep using these keep locked. It's still isolated confinement. It's still solitary confinement.
You have 10 more seconds.
So please, let's make these changes the correct way.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Okay, the meeting is now officially adjourned. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.